When I die, I desire no better winding sheet than the Stars and Stripes, and no softer pillar than the Constitution of my country.
Those are the words of Andrew Johnson, our 17th president, and the subject of this, the 17th episode of the Dead Presidents Podcast.
We back! It's season 2, baby! Season 2 of the Dead Presidents Podcast.
Your favorite podcast?
And ours.
'Cause it's the only one that has us in it.
That's right.
I'm James J. Hamilton.
And I'm Stephen Lincoln Douglas. And we're here. It's season 2. Season 1, we left off with an incredible cliffhanger. The immortal Abraham Lincoln had been killed. Is the Union going to survive?
Yeah, I assume our listeners have spent this whole season break wondering whether there's going to be a United States anymore, whether perhaps, the Confederacy survived as John Wilkes Booth hoped.
Is there two different countries right now? What's going on? Lincoln's dead. Well, we're back with the answers.
Yep, we got our 17th president, Andrew Johnson.
That's right,
Has he got the answers?
Well, we're going to find out. You may remember a little bit about Andrew Johnson. He was mentioned in the very first episode of the Dead Presidents Podcast.
Yeah, he appeared somewhat ignominiously.
That's correct.
In the top 5 drunkest presidents.
Yeah. Making a fool of himself at Lincoln's second inaugural.
We'll hear more about that.
Yeah, we remember the newspaper quote that said, "To think that one frail life stands between this insolent clown and the presidency is a terrifying prospect." Paraphrasing, but that was...
We will confront that prospect in this episode.
That's right, because
along with the nation.
About a month after that incident, Andrew Johnson became the President of the United States, but he wasn't born the President of the United States, James.
Far from it.
Far from it. Andrew Johnson, he's got quite a rise.
Yep. He's born about as low as any president ever has been.
That's it.
But in that classic presidential birthplace, a log cabin.
That's it. Let me switch into Sophia Petrillo mode here. Picture it. 1808, Raleigh, North Carolina. A poor family. 2 illiterate parents. The father, Jacob Johnson, working as a porter in the state bank and serving as captain of the town watch. Andrew Johnson, 3 years old. His father saves 3 men from drowning in a capsized boat. This is an effort that saps his strength and weakens his health and leads to his death by heart attack just a few weeks later.
Yep, much like Andrew Jackson, born into a poor family, and then his father dies.
Yeah.
Leaving a mother on her own, Polly Johnson, who had worked outside the home as a seamstress and a laundress, later leading to gossip that Andrew Johnson, who did not resemble his siblings, may have been fathered by someone else.
Ooh.
By maybe a lawyer in whose home Polly Johnson worked. That's the scuttlebutt on the street. After Jacob Johnson's death, Polly was forced to support Andrew and his older brother William on her own. She remarried to a man named Turner Dougherty, but he was just as poor as she was. They have no money to send the children to school, and Andrew Johnson is not going to receive a single day of formal education in his life.
No. James, Andrew Johnson's family's so poor that his mother had to send her children's labor by apprenticing them to a tailor. Not so much of a joke, but hard, cold fact, said Tailor James Selby. This was at the age of 10. And Andrew, he's bound to serve Selby until he turns 21.
Yeah, apprenticeship, it's like, he's contracted out.
That's right.
Obligated to work for this tailor.
It's definitely not going to take 11 years for him to not only learn but master the skills of being a tailor.
Yeah, I think, economic theorists like Adam Smith, author of Wealth of Nations, argued against apprenticeship as being very inefficient because it doesn't take 11 years to learn to become a tailor. So you're just, saddling young men with, preventing them from going out on their own.
That's it.
And that's something that Andrew wasn't going to be too happy about.
Yeah.
Because he can't go anywhere. He has no freedom. He's living in America. You're supposed to be free.
Well,
he, kind of starts seeing himself on the level of borderline slavery here.
Well, he is going to learn some things.
Yep. He does learn how to read in the tailor shop. Gets a hold of some books, hears some political discussions among those frequenting the shop. He got a book of speeches during that time that he studied closely and carried with him the rest of his life. Going to become quite a speaker. By the time he's 15, he's starting to really buck against his situation. Fallen into a crowd of similarly mischievous boys, he and his brother William were threatened with a lawsuit by a woman for throwing things at her house, and rather than face the music, Andrew and William run away from home and from their apprenticeship.
That's it. This is really the first strong inkling of a rebellious streak that is going to persist throughout the life of Andy Johnson. He's a little stinker. Mm-hmm. He's a little rebel.
So he's run away from his apprenticeship, and this segment of the Dead Presidents podcast is brought to you in part by our sponsor, James Selby, who publishes this important notice.
$10 reward. Ran away from the subscriber on the night of the 15th instant. 2 apprentice boys legally bound, named William and Andrew Johnson. I will pay the above reward to any person who will deliver said apprentices to me in Raleigh, or I will give the above reward for Andrew Johnson alone. All persons are cautioned against harboring or employing said apprentices on pain of being prosecuted.
And that's a message from our sponsor, James Selby. And that's a real newspaper ad that was posted to recapture Andrew Johnson.
That's right.
And his brother when they ran away. The Johnson brothers made it 60 miles away to Carthage, North Carolina. Andrew worked there as a tailor, but fearing that he would be arrested and returned to Selby, because they're fugitives now, he moved to Lawrence, South Carolina, where he worked as a tailor for 2 years, proving that he doesn't need 11 years to learn how to be a tailor.
Right.
It was there in South Carolina that he fell in love with a young lady, Mary Wood, made her a quilt as a gift, taking advantage of his tailor skills with the ladies. He proposed to her, but she turned him down because her family felt that he had little ability to support a family.
Ouch.
He went back to Raleigh, but could not find work there because it was known that he was legally bound to James Selby.
Now, this is an interesting part of the story. What does Johnson do here? He keep her running, or does he try to reconcile with his past? He chooses the latter. He returns to Selby. he offers to buy out his apprenticeship contract. But Selby names an outrageous price.
He wants money up front.
Yeah. Yeah, not only is it ludicrous, but he wants it up front.
Yeah.
And there's no way Johnson's going to be able to do that. So, what's Johnson going to do?
Well,
He's going to go west, young man.
yep. Like many young men of his generation.
Try to
Had
make a new
nothing
life for
left.
himself.
Yeah, where they come from. He's going to head west. He's going to head all the way to Knoxville, Tennessee on foot with little more than the clothes on his back, relying on the hospitality of strangers. Found himself in Mooresville, Alabama, where he worked as a tailor before heading to Columbia, Tennessee, hometown of President James K. Polk.
That's right.
By then, Johnson's mother and stepfather were moving to eastern Tennessee, where his brother William lived, so Andrew went back to Raleigh and helped them make their trip to Greenville, Tennessee, where he got a job in a tailor shop. The local tailor there was getting pretty old, and Andrew soon found himself in charge of a pretty prosperous tailoring business.
Yeah. He's got some pretty remarkable business savvy. He invests in real estate, hires employees, expands the tailor shop. Things aren't looking too awful bad for Andy Johnson, considering where he's come from at this point, and things are going to look up even more, because he's going to meet and fall in love with Eliza McCardle, daughter of a Greenville shoemaker. When she first saw him, she reportedly said, quote, "There goes the man I am going to marry." Johnson was 18 and Eliza 16 when they married in 1827. The ceremony was performed by Justice of the Peace Mordecai Lincoln, first cousin of Thomas Lincoln, father of Abe Lincoln.
Small world.
Small world indeed. Now, Eliza is going to be incredibly important, absolutely instrumental in Andy Johnson's further education, further self-education
Yeah.
of
He
himself.
He can read, but that's about it.
That's about it. But she's really gonna work with him, and he's gonna be able to read, write, do arithmetic. He's really gonna become educated. Him and his wife working together.
Mm-hmm.
Between 1828 and 1834, the couple would have 2 sons and 2 daughters, adding another son in 1852. Eliza was often in poor health, and she would rarely travel with Johnson during his political career. While he was president, their eldest daughter, Martha Johnson Patterson, she would handle the duties of White House hostess. So kind of an absentee first lady in a sense, like we've talked about with Buchanan and a couple others, that their wives had died by the time they got there, or were like Jane Pierce.
Yeah.
Was kind of incapable for a time of performing the hostess duties.
Yeah, Eliza.
So Martha Johnson Patterson.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Eliza Johnson had chronic tuberculosis.
Yeah.
Which laid her low for a while, and something that, I guess ran in the family or whatever, because a couple of his sons were going to suffer from TB as well.
Yeah, that old TB rearing its ugly head.
That'll get you.
It sure will.
We'll edit that out. So we got Johnson, he's risen from very humble roots to become a pretty prosperous local businessman. He's now a big man in town, and he's well placed to pursue his interest in politics.
That's right. And that leads to a little story, a little anecdote we have in terms of Johnson's early political days. One day, he's having a spirited political discussion with another citizen and the two men decide, let's arrange a public debate. You got a judge. You got an audience. And Johnson, he's going to prove himself to be a natural public speaker, James.
Yeah. Yeah, that event led to the formation of a debating society, and Johnson became an avid debater.
Some might say a master debater.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's how his political career started. That'd be like if you're at a bar and like two guys next to you are like arguing about politics. They decide to kind of take it outside, so to speak, and one of them ends up becoming president.
Yeah, that's it. That's basically the gist of it.
Yeah, because in 1829, Johnson, he's going to be elected a town alderman. And then in 34, he becomes mayor of Greenville, Tennessee.
That's right. And Tennessee, they're going to draft a new state constitution. Johnson's going to travel around campaigning for its ratification. And he's making a name for himself.
Yep.
But he's making a name for himself in another way that, at the time, really wouldn't have been considered for where he was at, making a name for himself. But he's making a name for himself in the annals of history.
Yeah, well, this would just be another status symbol of his rise.
That's right.
So, yeah, 1835, he's going to buy his first slave. A domestic slave, 14-year-old girl named Dolly. Later, he's going to buy her half-brother, Sam. And Dolly's going to go on to have 3 children who are going to be listed in the census records as mulattoes.
Yeah.
And Johnson, known to be particularly kind to Dolly and her children, often buying them presents.
Yeah.
There later comes around a rumor that Johnson had a, quote, colored concubine. But there is really no conclusive evidence either way whether he had this kind of relationship with Dolly.
Yeah. But those are the facts.
Yep. When he later criticized slavery during the Civil War, Johnson would express particular abhorrence over the institution's tendency to facilitate interracial sex and race mixing.
That's it. Was he perhaps speaking out vehemently on the subject because he was ashamed at himself?
We may never know. But by the 1840s, Johnson is going to sell his tailoring business to focus on politics and live on the income of successful real estate investments and a small farm that he owned, along with 8 or 9 slaves.
So,
speaking of
Andy
that
Johnson,
political career.
Yeah, he's coming up in the world a little bit, and he's moving into the political game. In 1835, he's going to run for the Tennessee House of Representatives. From Annette Gordon Reed's biography, quote, his 2 opponents, more prominent figures, looked formidable. Johnson's superior debating skills, however, stood him in good stead in the contest. He crushed his rivals in their first public debate, employing the take-no-prisoners style that would become his trademark. His talent for invective and savage ridicule apparently disoriented his opponents. They simply did not know how to respond to him. It is also possible that his early audiences had never seen anything like this, or simply were not expecting to see such a display of bravado from a semi-educated tailor confronting his social, quote, betters. But a little bit of the, quote, bully boy style goes a long way, and in later years this talent became something of a liability, because Johnson did not always know when to bring his inner attack dog to heel. Instead of disarming people, he began to offend as much as impress with his verbal assaults.
Yeah, it's a little bit of who Johnson was as a politician in terms of his style.
And that's it. And maybe our listeners, maybe number 45's got a little bit of that.
Yeah, sounds familiar. Well, Andy Johnson's going to win the election for Tennessee House of Representatives. He's in the game now. And though he was an admirer of President Andrew Jackson's unflinching stance against potential secessionists during the nullification crisis, Johnson is going to initially align himself with the Whig Party. However, he's not much of a party faithful kind of guy.
Yeah, he's not going to go full bore for him.
He opposes the maybe central Whig policy of government-funded internal improvements.
Yeah, that's a pretty big deal. I mean, that's one of the Whigs' major platforms. Mm-hmm. And right off the bat, he's like, I'm a Whig, but I don't agree with your main point.
Yeah, he voted against a bill that would extend a railroad into eastern Tennessee because he felt that it would take business away from inns and people who hauled goods by wagon. Which pissed a lot of people off at the time. Railroads are supposed to be the next big thing. And
yeah.
Johnson, with a pretty,
trying to look out for the underdog
attitude,
in a sense. Yeah.
Opposing the march of history.
Yeah.
He didn't make it very far with his anti-railroad stance.
Well, yeah, opposing the march of history, that might become trademark for Johnson. We'll see.
His vote on that bill produced a challenge to his re-election. He ended up being defeated in 1837.
That's it. So, what's he going to do now? Switch over allegiance.
Yeah, join the Democratic Party, who's more naturally opposed to internal improvements.
Yeah.
Got back to the State House of Representatives in 1839. In 41, stepped up to the Tennessee State Senate, and his popular speeches are turning him into a star within the state Democratic Party.
Yeah.
Yeah, this was kind of a tough time for Democrats.
It surely is, and we've talked
30s.
about this in the James K. Polk episode. Mm-hmm. Polk's gubernatorial campaigns.
Yeah.
From around this time. What a task.
Yeah.
Things are pretty divided in Tennessee.
Yeah, he's going to win the presidential election soon enough, but he lost 2 statewide gubernatorial elections
back to back before becoming elected president. Mm-hmm. And Johnson's coming up in this too.
He's a guy who's winning for Tennessee Democrats at the time.
That's it. And I wonder if perhaps his former Whig tendencies had anything to do with that. Maybe they thought that he was somebody that could reach across the aisle, so to speak.
Yeah.
But that's going to lead Andrew Johnson in 1842 to being elected to the U.S. House of Representatives. And he's going to just continue to display this independent streak. It's pretty much a prime Andy Johnson characteristic, his fierce independence.
Yeah.
He breaks with the Democrats on tariffs. He doesn't get along with James K. Polk.
You got a fellow Tennessee Democrat in the White House. You think he and Johnson would be natural allies?
Quite the opposite. Yeah. Polk is going to go on to describe Johnson in his diary as, quote, vindictive and perverse in his temper and conduct. Now, Johnson, he dislikes Polk, and the feeling's mutual. But Johnson does support the Mexican-American War, and he votes against the Wilmot Proviso. That seeks to ban slavery in any territories acquired from Mexico. So those are 2 big Polk points where Johnson agrees, but on a bunch of other things, Johnson not so much playing ball and pissing off the president to the point where he makes note of it in his diary. Now, there's plenty of people that Lincoln, with his spot resolutions, tries to lambaste the president, and he doesn't even get a mention.
Yeah.
Andy Johnson does, to a point where Polk makes note of it. But of course, Johnson's supposed to be a fellow Democrat. What's he doing?
He's doing his own thing.
That's pretty much it. Yeah,
and then during the crisis of 1850, he he proposed his own compromise that would have admitted California as a free state and give the District of Columbia back to slave state Maryland with a stronger fugitive slave law. He said at the time, quote, "Slavery itself has its foundation and will find its perpetuity in the Union, and the Union its continuance by a non-interference with the institution of slavery."
Yeah. He's going to end up supporting the Compromise of 1850, but he's going to vote against abolishing the slave trade in the District of Columbia. In 1852, he champions the Homestead Bill, which would make federal western land available to settlers at cheap prices. Helping poor, landless white people gain financial independence was a cause near and dear to his heart. Though as president, he's going to go on to oppose similar relief proposals aimed at helping freed slaves.
Yeah, the Homestead Bill's really his bread and butter.
Yeah.
This is where he feels that he can help people like himself when he was younger who didn't have, feels he's practically enslaved to a tailor in an apprenticeship because, people like him don't have their own land.
Yeah.
That would grant them financial independence. That's what he's pushing for people in his position.
That's right.
That bill is going to pass the House, but not the Senate, although Johnson's not quite done with it.
No.
In 1852, however, Whigs in the Tennessee legislature gerrymandered Johnson's district into a safe Whig seat, and he was forced not to run for re-election.
Not an unfamiliar thing. Gerrymandering. Damn you, gerrymandering! However, it's not over for Johnson.
Mm-hmm.
He's going to return to Tennessee, and he makes the decision to run for governor, banking on his appeal to the common man. He faced his Whig opponent in debates while trading political favors in behind-the-scenes deal with Whig politicians that secured him cross-party support. He's going to win the election. But the Tennessee governorship, as we've heard so many times before, people being dissatisfied with the governorship. This is Thomas Jefferson, John Tyler, go through.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It's just not a powerful position. It's not a big office.
Yeah, the powerful executive of the presidency was a little bit anomalous at the time. The distrust of executive power in the early years, most of the state constitutions had very powerful legislatures and very weak governors.
That's it.
And Virginia was one, and Tennessee another, where future presidents did very, very little as governor.
That's it.
Because they don't have any power.
And, the legislature is controlled by Whigs at this time.
Yeah.
So, that's another thing. Now, the governor can recommend legislation in biannual messages to the legislature, and Johnson, he's going to take advantage of this opportunity and promote his populist views. He supports a bill raising taxes to double the public education budget. Now, he was denied an education himself. So, obviously, he believes that the poor white people that he champions can improve their circumstances by learning to read and write.
Yeah, that was really his big accomplishment as governor, and another position he took that's aimed at all the little Andrew Johnsons out there at this time who
that's it,
to have the advantages he didn't have.
Yep.
He's going to get himself reelected in 1855. In that campaign, he denounced the anti-immigrant Know Nothing Party while stressing his support for the continuing institution of slavery.
Yeah.
He spoke out against banks, against paper money. One of his proposals was that Andrew Jackson's home, the Hermitage, should be made into the Tennessee governor's mansion. Then in 1856, Johnson, he's going to float himself as a potential candidate for the Democratic presidential nomination. didn't really pick up any traction. Next year, he successfully campaigns for a fellow Democrat to succeed him as governor and for Democrats to take over the Tennessee state legislature. And as we know, at that time, state legislatures chose U.S. senators. So who do you think they're going to pick?
Yeah. None other than Andy Johnson.
He's going to the U.S. Senate.
That's right. And in the Senate, Johnson dusted off the old Homestead Bill that had passed the House years earlier. He's going to make a push for its passage, but he's going to find that his proposal to hand out Western land to poor whites had become enmeshed in the rancorous debate over the expansion of slavery into the Western territories. Some Southerners fear that giving land to small farmers who would work the land themselves would limit opportunities for potentially large slave plantations. And here we go back to a statement that I'll just stand by and how goddamn stupid these arguments are.
Yeah, that's part of what the argument about, I mean, this kind of, I think, gets to the heart of what the argument about moving slavery west was. Because people who are against slavery most of this time are not against it out of concern for the rights of slaves.
Right.
And certainly not out of any belief that black people are equal or deserve fair treatment. But it's about who is this Western territory going to be for?
Yeah.
Is this going to be places where rich guys with a bunch of slaves are going to control it? Or is it going to be a bunch of middle-class white guys owning their own farms?
We took it from the red man. We're going to keep it from the black man.
Yeah.
That's pretty much the white man's take on it. And I've said before, and I'll say it again, I hate the white man.
Yep. Well, Andy Johnson is on the side of the small white man over the rich one.
Yeah.
And he doesn't like that slavery is getting in the way of this bill, which he doesn't think that this doesn't have anything to do with slavery. But, we're coming up on, 1859? Everything is about slavery.
Yeah.
John Brown does his raid on Harper's Ferry, and at that time, Johnson is going to start trying to court Southern support for his bill, argues in a speech that the Declaration of Independence, which said all men are created equal, did not apply to black people. Johnson claimed that slavery was a positive good because it increased wages for working class white people. So, after some significant amendments to appease Southerners, the Homestead Bill is going to pass the Senate in June 1860, but then President James Buchanan vetoed it.
Yeah. Johnson
pushed for a veto override, but could not gain enough support. Yet another reason James Buchanan is perhaps the worst president of all time, at least from Andrew Johnson's perspective.
Well, yeah.
Side note, the Homestead Bill is eventually going to become law in 1862. But there's going to be a lot of other shit going on by that point.
Yeah, that's it.
In 1860, Andrew Johnson will again float himself as a candidate for the Democratic presidential nomination. He's hoping that he will become the compromise candidate of a deadlocked convention.
That's right. We've spoken about this. We got a pretty severe split going on here. But there's not going to be a compromise. There's going to be a breakup.
Yeah.
You got Northern and Southern Democrats breaking apart.
They have competing conventions.
That's right.
So they're not compromising on anybody or anything. You
got Northern Democrats siding with Stephen A. Douglas. You got Southern Democrats siding with John C. Breckinridge, the sitting vice president under Buchanan. Mm-hmm. And you got an offshoot of Democrats and Whigs going for John Bell with the new Constitutional Union Party.
Yep. Some of Franklin Pierce's friends at the time were trying to have him considered as a compromise candidate.
That's right. There's stuff going on all over the place.
But nobody's thinking Andrew Johnson at the time.
Certainly not. And
we know how 1860 election turns out.
Nope, we got a four-way race. And Republican candidate, just the second Republican candidate in history. We had John C. Fremont in 1856. Now Abraham Lincoln in 1860. He'd made a name for himself in 1858, debating Stephen Douglas in Illinois Senate debates. Losing that election, but now bouncing back 2 years later and defeating Douglas and two others.
Yep.
To become president of the loosely United States.
Well, they won't be united by the time he gets in there.
That's right.
Because outraged southern states respond to his election victory by announcing their secession from the Union, and members of Congress from the seceding states are resigning their seats and joining the Confederacy. On June 8th, 1861, Tennessee became the last state to secede from the Union. Now,
and what is Senator Andrew Johnson going to do?
You'll find out after this word from our sponsors. The Dead Presidents Podcast is brought to you in part by Dr. Robert Culverwell, M.D., who just published a new essay titled Manhood, How Lost, How Restored. A lecture on the nature, treatment, and radical cure of seminal weakness, involuntary emissions, sexual debility, impediments to marriage generally, nervousness, consumption, epilepsy, fits, mental and physical incapacity resulting from self-abuse. The world-renowned Dr. Culverwell in this admirable lecture clearly proves from his own experience that the awful consequences of self-abuse may be effectually removed without medicine and without dangerous surgical operations. He points out a mode of cure at once certain and effectual by which every sufferer, no matter what his condition may be, may cure himself cheaply, privately, and radically. This lecture will prove a boon to thousands, sent under seal to any address in a plain envelope for just 6 cents.
Now that's convenience.
Listeners, has your lifelong habit of chronic self-abuse left you sexually debilitated to the point of impotence? Then you need to listen to Dr. Robert Culverwell, who knows from his own extremely embarrassing personal experience that there is a way out of the dark and pitiful hole you've dug yourself into. You won't believe how many times a day Dr. Culverwell used to engage in self-abuse. I don't know how he had time to get his medical degree, but he did, and he's now used his medical acumen to develop a miracle cure for this most destructive habit. Dr. Culverwell is a man once again, and you can be too if you pony up 6 cents for a copy of Manhood, How Lost, How Restored. That's a message from our sponsor, Dr. Robert Culverwell, M.D.
I'll bet the M.D. stands for Master of his Domain.
That's right.
We're proud to be sponsored by Laughlin's Infant Cordial. Baby at midnight, screaming at the top of its voice, disturbs all the sleepy heads of the house and your next-door neighbor. How often you hear the thoughtless remark, "Choke that squalling baby!" Now, this is very unkind of you, my friend. Once, you had just such a time, teething, colic, pain, fretful, wakeful fever, bowels disturbed, no sleep for childs or parents, a long night watching, and a weary morning dawn, bringing no rest. Try 1 bottle of Laughlin's Infant Cordial, and baby rests sweetly. The little teeth come through nicely. Mama is rested, Papa is ready for breakfast, and your neighbor will not say, "Hang the baby." Blessed be Lawland's infant cordial, only 25 cents a bottle. Listeners, is your neighbor constantly on the verge of brutally murdering your baby? Have sleepless nights turned you into a languid zombie, shuffling listlessly about in drowsy oblivion? Do you secretly wish your neighbor would have the balls to act on his threats? The Dead President's Podcast has a less drastic solution to your problems. Lachlan's Infant Cordial. A dollop or two of this miraculous potion, and the adorable little bastard will be out cold. You can get some much-needed rest, and your neighbor can stop trying to figure out how to tie a tiny little noose. Lawland's Infant Cordial is the only medicine on the market that ensures that you will sleep through the night and that the guy next door will not draw and quarter your little bundle of joy.
That's a Laughlin's Infant Cordial guarantee.
This has been a message from our sponsor, Laughlin's Infant Cordial.
We're also proud to be sponsored by Mrs. Holmes, who publishes this important notice. Wet nurse wanted to take care of a child 8 months old at her own home, or to bring it up by the bottle. To those who keep their own cow, a home in the country preferred. You heard that, listeners. Our sponsor, Mrs. Holmes, is looking for a healthy young lady to nourish her child with natural human breast milk, or at least a country farmer willing to bottle feed the little tyke with cow's milk. Next best thing, right? Basically anyone who will agree to take this baby off her hands and has some kind of white liquid that will keep it from dying. As long as Mrs. Holmes can get this kid out of her house, she'll be happy.
Sounds like she could use some Laughlin's Infant Cordial.
That may be. And if any of our listeners are currently lactating, or if you happen to have a jug of unexpired milk in the fridge, hit us up on Twitter at DeadPresPodcast, and we can put you in touch with Mrs. Holmes, who is ready to pay top dollar to have someone else, anyone else, raise her child.
And now, back to the show. And we're back. Talking about Senator Andrew Johnson. Tennessee. It looks like it's gonna potentially secede from the Union. But before this cascade of southern states begins seceding, Johnson is gonna push for a compromise that would appease Southerners, and he's going to consider proposals to divide Western territories between free and slave states. Now, he believes the Union has to be preserved, no matter what. Now, he's utter Jacksonian in that particular regard.
Yep.
Our federal union, it must be preserved. Johnson is of that ilk.
Yeah. Yeah, this is his big Jacksonian moment.
Right.
Gives a speech in the Senate saying that while the federal government could not coerce the states, it could enforce and execute federal laws on individuals within a state, and that South Carolinians preparing to make war against the United States were committing treason.
That's right.
He said, "I will not give up this government. No, I intend to stand by it. And I invite every man who is a patriot to rally around the altar of our common country and swear by our God and all that is sacred and holy that the Constitution shall be saved and the Union preserved."
Yeah. That's going to lead to Andy Johnson being praised in the North and denounced in the South. His home state of Tennessee teetering on the brink of secession, and his advocacy initially helps keep it in the Union. But then the war begins with the attack on Fort Sumter. And Tennessee is going to turn against Andy Johnson.
Yep, he's going to tour his home state to speak in favor of the Union, and he's going to get death threats. He's going to be nearly lynched by mobs. Tennessee's going to go out of the Union. But Andy Johnson is going to return to Washington, D.C., where he will be the only senator from a seceded state who remains loyal to the Union.
Yeah.
He proposed a Senate resolution stating that the Union war effort was about maintaining the supremacy of the Constitution and not about overthrowing the institutions of the southern states. That's going to pass the Senate.
Yeah.
And Johnson's going to join the Senate Committee on the Conduct of the War. He's going to pressure Abraham Lincoln to send troops to retake Tennessee. And by early 1862, most of western and middle Tennessee is going to be captured by the Union Army, and Abe Lincoln's going to appoint Andy Johnson as military governor of Tennessee.
That's right. Now, Johnson here, with his words, he states that the Union war effort is about maintaining the supremacy of the Constitution, not about overthrowing the institutions of the southern states. Kind of a lost causer in that sense.
Well, I mean, this is the very beginning of the war.
Right.
And even, even Lincoln and them weren't saying slavery's done yet.
Right.
This is when they're trying to, keep the border states in. So that's a kind of thing that Lincoln might say to like Kentucky and Missouri. Yeah. But Johnson, he's going to believe that in his heart.
Well, sure.
Pretty permanently.
Yeah. It's kind of why Lincoln got pissed off at John Fremont, if you remember in the last episode. Fremont kind of jumping the gun.
Yeah.
A little bit.
Well.
In the eyes of Lincoln and
yeah. Well, Johnson's
most of the white men in control.
Johnson's going to keep that gun holstered.
That's right. But now, he's military governor of Tennessee.
Mm-hmm.
And he believes that, quote, traitors must be punished and treason crushed. So, he's going to demand loyalty oaths from public officials and jails the mayor of Nashville when said mayor refuses to take this oath. He shuts down newspapers that were hostile to the Union, and he encourages the establishment of pro-Union newspapers. Johnson's wife, daughter, and 2 sons were uprooted by the war, and while traveling, came under the control of Confederate General Nathan Bedford Forrest, who refused to let them go until the Confederate governor of Tennessee intervened and released them back to Johnson.
Yep.
Now that's some serious shit there.
Yep, war's hitting pretty close to home. Nathan Bedford Forrest, of course, best known as the namesake of Forrest Gump.
Yeah. Yeah, perhaps best known.
Yep.
Yeah.
He also had something to do with the KKK, I believe.
Yeah. Yeah,
well,
there was that.
That's in a future that...
When we do our Nathan Bedford Forrest episode, you're going to hear all about him and the people that praise him for being one of the greatest cavalry officers in history will be appeased, as will the people that think that he's a loathsome, despicable, silly, miserable, disgusting wretch will also be appeased. Because that's the Dead President's Podcast way.
Yep.
The whole truth and nothing but the truth. Which brings us back to Andrew Johnson.
Yeah, because, he had owned slaves. He supported slavery his whole life. And at the beginning of the Civil War, he hoped that the Union would be restored with slavery intact.
Right.
But as the war, continues, that looks less and less possible. And after the Emancipation Proclamation in January 1863, Johnson begins to see that abolition is inevitable and that maintaining slavery is preventing the restoration of the Union.
That's it. His argument is, since the institution of slavery had prompted the Southern overthrow of the federal government, the Union had the right to destroy it.
Yeah, and this, Emancipation Proclamation doesn't apply to the part of Tennessee that Johnson governs at the time, because it didn't apply behind Union lines. But Johnson, he's going to start recruiting black people into the Union Army, but he's going to try to have them be limited to doing manual labor rather than serving as soldiers.
Yeah. Now, I want to touch on this just briefly. The Union, yeah, absolutely. 54th Mass.
Mm-hmm.
These initial recruits, it's pretty much like, carry my shit.
Yeah.
Do this for me. Make sure clean my uniform.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the Confederacy, regardless of what anybody tries to say, there were no people of color that actively served for the Confederacy. None. They were slaves being made to do.
Mm-hmm.
Any reports, and there are some reports from Union higher-ups talking about, seeing armed people of color with the Confederates, and they weren't legitimate troops. It was, they were carrying goods for their masters.
Mm-hmm.
Essentially, there were no troops of color. There were no black Confederates. That is absolute bullshit.
Yeah.
And initially,
yeah, because
it wasn't
the racist white
come
Southerners.
one, come all for the Union.
Yeah, racist white Southerners don't, they don't believe that black people are capable or could be trusted to be soldiers. And I think towards the very end of the Civil War, when the Confederacy is about to collapse and it has used up all its manpower, someone in the Confederacy suggests, hey, maybe we need black soldiers. And that's the intellectual foundation of the Confederacy just colliding with reality and imploding.
Yeah.
We can't survive without black soldiers, but if we allow black soldiers, then the entire intellectual basis for our existence is undermined.
Yeah.
And that's the end of the Confederacy anyway.
Yeah.
But then you got guys like Johnson who kind of share that view, but are willing to use African Americans to beat the South, but he wants to limit them and keep them in their place as much as he can.
Yeah.
Lincoln at this time, he's going to be issuing an amnesty proclamation that would restore the status of seceded states once 10% of their electorate had taken a loyalty oath. And Johnson is going to be more stringent than Lincoln. He wants an even more stringent version of the oath administered in Tennessee and require everyone to take it, even people who had never joined the Confederacy.
Yeah.
He's tough on loyalty to the Union.
Yeah. He wants it to be like a blanket oath. Everybody is going to take it, regardless of circumstance.
So Lincoln's 10% plan and his strategy for, reintegrating the southern states is going to, be a major factor in Johnson's presidency. I think it's probably worth noting at this point, at least, Lincoln, he has this spirit of reconciliation and kind of offering somewhat easy terms for readmission at the time. Congress was not happy about this 10% plan.
That's right.
To pass a more stringent plan. But at least part of Lincoln's motivation at this time is to break the will of the Confederacy by making it look like they will get, an easy restoration. If Confederates are hanging on thinking, hey, getting back into the Union's going to be pretty easy, why are we still fighting? That calculus might change a little bit once the South has been totally defeated.
Yeah, well, you got to think about the average Southern soldier, too.
Mm-hmm.
once it gets to a certain point, we're not quite there yet, but there's people gonna start to say, fuck this shit, I'm going home.
Mm-hmm.
Our homes are in trouble.
Yeah.
Like, that's what I'm fighting for. I don't even own any slaves.
Mm-hmm.
I'm gonna split. I'm going back home.
Yeah.
My family needs protection.
Yeah, so, Lincoln's trying to
and
help,
Lincoln's gonna
he's trying
hop
to
on that.
help those guys get to that fuck this shit moment.
Mm-hmm.
But by the time Johnson's president, all their shit is fucked.
Right.
So, but Johnson's going to keep his eye on Lincoln's reconciliation strategy. But
that's it.
Let's not get ahead of ourselves, because Lincoln, he might not even get reelected.
His reelection, it's far from assured.
Yeah, the war's dragging on. He's got opposition in his own party, as we just mentioned, from Congress. People who think he's going too easy on the South, not pushing abolition hard enough. Also, those thinking he's bungling the war.
Yeah.
And that this thing wouldn't be dragging on for years if someone else was in charge. You got some Republicans nominating John C. Fremont as president. As we mentioned, he was pushing abolition harder and earlier.
Yeah.
And then you also got Northern Democrats. They're going to nominate General George B. McClellan.
Yeah.
So how's the Lincoln team going to approach their reelection?
Well, he's got to try and breach between these two sides. You got the quote-unquote radical abolitionists that are going for Fremont, and you got the Northern Democrats going for McClellan, and each might sap from the people in the middle. So how is Lincoln going to create a median between these? Well, he's going to need the right vice presidential candidate, and that is not Hannibal Hamlin, who was the vice president initially under Lincoln. Hamlin, staunch abolitionist from Maine. He's just he's too far.
Yeah, that's not
for
really,
Lincoln to reach middle ground here.
Yeah. Lincoln, he once joked that he didn't worry about Confederates assassinating him because that would make Hannibal Hamlin president.
Yeah.
Which Confederates would rather have Lincoln in there than Hamlin.
Right.
But that's not helping Lincoln with Democrats, which is, I guess, who they're trying to appeal to here. Because they want to broaden their appeal. They're not even going to call themselves the Republican Party. They're the National Union Party.
Yeah.
Because they want war Democrats on board. And, when I read the David Herbert Donald biography of Lincoln, it seems unclear how much Lincoln himself actually was involved in choosing the vice president. In that book, it sounded like he didn't really say anything about it, and that if he had wanted Hamlin back, all he had to do was say so, and that's what they would have got. But his kind of managers at the convention didn't really hear from him, so they kind of just did their own thing.
Yeah.
And someone, proposed Hannibal Hamlin to be renominated, and that did not pass the convention. And then somebody, an Indiana delegate, says, hey, what about Andrew Johnson? He's a Southern war Democrat.
Yeah.
There's no one else that could more effectively broaden this ticket.
No, there really isn't.
So Johnson is going to lead Hamlin on the first ballot, and then he's going to keep gaining support on a few more ballots, and then he's going to get a unanimous vote in favor of his nomination as vice president.
That's it. And Lincoln, he's going to respond positively, saying, quote, Andy Johnson, I think, is a good man.
Yeah, you got this poor illiterate tailor boy rising to be chosen as vice president in wartime.
And that's it. I mean, most importantly, he's a loyalist.
Yep. He stayed loyal to the Union no matter what, in that classic Jackson and even Taylor mode.
That did it. Who better?
And then, hey, he's great at going around giving campaign speeches. That's what he's going to do on behalf of the Lincoln ticket. Well, he's going to argue that slavery promoted race mixing and that it contaminated the once pure blood of the South.
Oh, boy.
Well, he also claimed that ending slavery would end the, quote, slaveocracy, by which wealthy plantation owners used slave labor to keep poor white people down.
Yeah, Johnson always had this anti-rich stigma. He was always a man of the working class.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and he considered slavery to be an unholy alliance that benefited plantation owners and black slaves at the expense of the white working class.
Oof.
And now that he's turned on slavery, that's the, tack that he takes on it.
Yeah.
And then you have kind of a interesting episode in his vice presidential campaign.
Yeah.
He's in Nashville, and there's a delegation of free black people that come to speak to him. And he said that the storm of persecution endured by, quote, colored people had almost induced him to wish that a Moses might arise to lead them safely to the promised land of freedom and happiness. Someone in the crowd suggests, hey, maybe Andy Johnson can be their Moses. He said that their Moses would be revealed in due time, but when they insisted, he said that, quote, if no better shall be found, he would be their Moses and lead them through the Red Sea of war and bondage to a fairer future of liberty and peace when every man has a fair chance in the race of life.
Yeah. Now,
unlikely words coming from Andy Johnson.
Right, and whether or not he actually meant it, the speech is going to receive national attention. Some taking Johnson seriously, others arguing that he was just telling the crowd of assembled people of color what they wanted to hear, and that he was just basically willing to say anything to win votes and advance his own personal ambition. Now, in the end, a series of Union military victories in the summer and fall of 1864, that's what it's going to take to clinch the election for Lincoln and Johnson.
They're going to win big. So the irony is, I guess, that Lincoln didn't need, to put a Democrat on the ticket. Like, he could have put anyone on there, and he would have ended up winning.
Yeah, circumstances just worked out that way. But at the time, I mean...
yeah, things, things were up in the air. It
wasn't looking like a certainty for Lincoln. I mean,
no.
By any stretch.
Yeah, but they win the election, and then in December, the Union Army is going to finally gain complete control over all of Tennessee. In January, there's a state constitutional convention in Tennessee, and Johnson, who is still the military governor, urged the convention delegates to abolish slavery.
Yeah.
So he's on board with that, at least.
That's it. So now, it's
going to bring us...
poor, semi-literate, indentured servant, Taylor, has become the vice president of the United States.
That's bringing us to his inauguration.
That's it.
That's his big coming out party.
That's it.
He's going to be on the biggest stage. He's going to give the biggest speech of his life.
He's going to show himself to the nation. He's going to reinforce any doubters that said, why would Lincoln pick Andy Johnson? Well, he's going to show you why. But he's in poor health when he travels to Washington, D.C. for the March 4th inauguration. Now, the night before the inauguration, Johnson is going to share many glasses of whiskey with a friend.
Not too sick to do a little celebrating.
No, and, of course, that was doctor prescribed.
Well, unsurprisingly, the next morning he's not going to be feeling better.
No.
But he's going to stop by, Vice President Hamlin's office on his way to the Senate for his swearing in. And still feeling poorly, naturally, he's going to ask for some whiskey. Hamlin looks on in amazement as Johnson quickly downed 3 full glasses of whiskey. They proceeded to the Senate chamber, where history witnessed the infamous debacle that earned Johnson the number 3 spot on our top 5 drunkest presidents.
That's right. Everyone was there. The Senate, the House, the Supreme Court, the Cabinet, President Lincoln, foreign diplomats, all on hand to witness Johnson's inauguration as vice president. Johnson rose to speak, and it was immediately apparent that something was amiss. Everyone soon realized that Johnson was blind drunk. Republicans watched in horror, and Democrats with spiteful glee, as Johnson, who's supposed to speak for 5 minutes, goes on to ramble incoherently for 15 minutes. We talked about it in the episode 1 top 5. I'm a-coming for to tell you here today, yes, I'm a-coming for to tell you here today that I'm a plebeian. I glory in it. Going on to name everyone, calling out people by name, not remembering everybody's name, asking other people, what's his name? Who's that? Bad. Hamlin tries to tug on his coat sleeve to get his attention and be like, nope.
Yeah, he said
that doesn't work.
He said, we all derive our power from the people. And then he's calling out each cabinet secretary saying, you derive your power from the people. And then he can't remember one of their names. He's like, who's the Secretary of the Navy?
Yeah.
Someone says Gideon Wells. He's like, you, Mr. Wells, Secretary of the Navy, get your power from the people.
Yeah.
And that, he just goes on and on in that vein. Finally, I think Hamlin got him to stop. Then he goes to take the oath of office, and he picks up the Bible and said, I kiss this book in the face of my nation of the United States.
Oh, boy.
Like, whoever picks up the Bible to kiss it when giving an oath. Following this shameful display, the dignitaries left the Senate chamber and went outside to hear Lincoln deliver his second inaugural address, perhaps the greatest speech in American history.
Certainly one of the greatest.
By stark contrast,
right.
Johnson's speech was described by witnesses as a rambling and strange harangue that was listened to with pain and mortification by all his friends.
That's right.
The man is certainly deranged, either drunk or crazy, they said. They called him a drunken bore and a low sot. Future President Rutherford B. Hayes wrote to his wife, it was lucky you did not come to the inauguration. The bad weather and Andy Johnson's disgraceful drunkenness spoiled it.
That's it. And we've talked about all this before. It's just terrible scene. The New York World newspaper writes, quote, the drunken and beastly Caligula, the most profligate of all the Roman emperors, raised his horse to the dignity of consul, an office that in former times had been filled by the greatest warriors and statesmen of the Republic. The consulship was scarcely more disgraced by that scandalous transaction than is our vice presidency by the late election. This office has been adorned in better days by the talents and accomplishments of Adams and Jefferson, Clinton and Gerry, Calhoun and Van Buren. And now to see it filled with this insolent, drunken brute, in comparison with whom even Caligula's horse was respectable. And to think that only one frail human life stands between this insolent, clownish drunkard and the presidency. May God bless and spare Abraham Lincoln. Should this Andrew Johnson become his successor, the decline and fall of the American Republic would smell as rank in history as that of the Roman Empire under such atrocious monsters in shape as Nero and Caligula.
Wow.
Harsh, Harsh words.
His speech not getting great reviews.
Certainly not.
Some senators considered introducing a resolution calling for Johnson to resign. Lincoln said to a concerned cabinet member, "I have known Andy Johnson for many years. He made a bad slip the other day, but you need not be scared. Andy ain't a drunkard."
No. Prior to this incident, Johnson, he hadn't ever been accused of drunkenness. Those close to him variously reported that he never drank with meals, that he never drank when he was a senator, that he drank 2 to 4 glasses of whiskey on occasion, and that he drank heavily but never got drunk.
Well,
Kind of conflicting.
this incident is going to haunt his career. Thereafter, his political opponents will regularly accuse him of drunkenness.
That's right. It only takes one time.
Yep. I mean, when it's
Especially
on
in that setting.
Yeah, when it's on that big of a stage, you're not going to live that one down.
No, certainly not.
Well, within a couple weeks, Johnson's health will recover. And then Richmond fell to the Union Army. Johnson made public appearances calling for leading rebels to be executed.
Yeah.
On
Now that's important to remember.
Yep. On April 14th, 1865, Johnson saw Lincoln for the first time since the inauguration when he visited the White House and urged Lincoln against being lenient with the traitors.
Yep.
Later on that evening, Lincoln attended a play at Ford's Theater.
That's right. And we know how the third act of that play wrapped up.
Yep.
10:15 p.m. Andy Johnson is asleep in his room at the Kirkwood House Hotel when he was awakened and informed that Lincoln had been shot. There was also information that Secretary of State William Seward was seriously wounded, potentially going to die in an attempt on his life. Little did Johnson know that he himself was being stalked.
Well, guards were posted outside the Kirkwood house to protect him. And, they didn't know, but the man assigned to kill Johnson, a co-conspirator of John Wilkes Booth, George Atzerodt, he was already in the hotel.
Yeah.
He'd taken a room at the Kirkwood house that morning. But, rather than carry out his mission, George Atzerodt lost his nerve and began drinking at the hotel bar. He became heavily intoxicated and spent the night wandering the streets.
One of those instances where drinking saved the day.
Yep. Johnson's vice presidency framed by drinking incidents.
Yeah.
It began with him embarrassing himself and then ended with a different guy drinking, ended up saving his life.
Yeah.
After learning that Lincoln was near death, Johnson insisted on going to see him at the Patterson House across from Ford's Theater, but he did not stay long.
Now, he kind of felt that his presence wasn't really wanted.
Yeah.
It wasn't a great scene.
No. And
Lincoln, of course, going to die at 7:22 a.m. on the morning of April 15th. A couple hours later, Chief Justice Salmon P. Chase heads on over to the Kirkwood House and administers the presidential oath of office to now President Andrew Johnson.
Yep. The unthinkable contingency that the New York world lamented
has come to pass. And
what is going to happen?
What is going to happen? Andrew Johnson is now the President of the United States. He had called for hanging the traitorous rebels, and people had ideas of his ideas on people of color and their position in the world.
Well, the past week, Lee surrendered to Granite Appomattox, and now Johnson's president. The whole mess is going to fall into his lap.
Yeah.
We'll find out what he does after this word from our sponsors.
Thanks for listening. The Dead Presidents Podcast is brought to you in part by Moyer's Drug Store, which publishes this important notice. Drugs, drugs, drugs. Moyer's Drug Store at the corner of Main and Market Streets has a good assortment of pure drugs, medicines, paints, oils, and varnishes, always on hand, and sold cheaper than at any other drugstore in town. Quality guaranteed. Moyer's Drug Store has Weishart's Tar Cordial, Baker's Cod Liver Oil, Winslow's Soothing Syrup, and many other reliable patent medicines. Prescriptions carefully compounded by J.R. Moyer himself. Also available, leather of all kinds, wholesale and retail. If you're like most of our listeners, you actively use a copious amount of drugs. One thing every drug user needs is a steady and reliable source from which to procure a wide variety of potent drugs at reasonable prices. Well, you're in luck, because Moyer's Drug Store is ready to hook you up with whatever you're jonesing for. Are you suffering from Winslow's Soothing Syrup withdrawal? Moyer's has the purest batch in town. While you're there, you could pick up some premium leather at wholesale prices. If you happen to be a drug user and a leather fetishist, Moyer's is a one-stop shop. That's a message from our sponsor, Moyer's Drug Store.
And we're proud to be sponsored by Hall's Vegetable Sicilian Hair Renewer. Gray hair is restored to its original youthful color by the use of Hall's Vegetable Sicilian Hair Renewer. It will make hair grow upon bald heads, except in very aged persons, as it furnishes the nutritive principle by which the hair is nourished and supported. It will prevent the hair from falling out and does not stain the skin. No better evidence of its superiority need be adduced than the fact that so many imitations of it are offered to the public. It is a splendid hairdressing for sale by all druggists. Listeners, does your gray hair make you look old and decrepit? Does your bald or balding scalp make you repulsive to women? Whatever your hideous hair deficiency, Sicily has the solution. With Hall's Vegetable Sicilian Hair Renewer, you can look like a virile young man again. Rub a little bit of Hall's on your noggin, and you'll have more hair than you know what to do with. Pick some up whenever you visit Moyer's Drug Store, because they carry it alongside their mountain of other drugs, and you won't get a better price anywhere. That's a message from our sponsor, Hall's Vegetable Sicilian Hair Renewer.
We're also proud to be sponsored by Chancellor's Hair Exterminator for removing superfluous hair. To the ladies especially, this invaluable depilatory recommends itself as being an almost indispensable article to female beauty, is easily applied, does not burn or injure the skin, but acts directly on the roots. It is warranted to remove superfluous hair from low foreheads or from any part of the body completely, totally, and radically, extirpating the same, leaving the skin soft, smooth, and natural. This is the only article used by the French, and is the only real, effectual depilatory in existence. Only 75 cents per package. Listeners, Chancellor's Hair Exterminator is perfect for all of your hair removal needs. Ladies, if you're growing a bit of a mustache and have an offensive unibrow situation, or if you just want to keep your private area spick and span for that special someone, Chancellor's is the only choice. Gentlemen, if you could use a little manscaping, or if you overdosed on Hall's Vegetable Sicilian Hair Renewer and need to dial it back a bit, reach for chancellors. And guess who stocks a full supply of Chancellor's Hair Exterminator on their shelves? That's right. Whether you have too much hair or not enough, Moyer's Drugstore has you covered. Listeners, hit us up on Twitter at DeadPresPodcast and show us the before and after photos of your hair renewal or hair extermination adventures.
And now, back to the show.
And we're back, and ready to dive into the presidency of Andrew Johnson. His underdog story is culminated in semi-literate tailor turned politician Andy Johnson finding himself President of the United States. Now, on the day that he assumes the presidency, Johnson holds his first cabinet meeting, and he's going to request that all of Lincoln's cabinet members remain in office.
A little bit of continuity.
Yeah.
Pretty important.
Indeed. And, you know, Johnson didn't get off to a great look in the national eye. What with his swearing in as vice president debacle.
Yeah.
So he needs to try and make a good look for himself, and he's come in a pretty shit way.
Yeah. I mean, first president ever to be assassinated.
Yeah.
Rocks the nation, really. You know, there's the manhunt for John Wilkes Booth.
Yeah.
They're rounding up the rest of the conspirators. The Civil War is just ending, but who knows what's going to happen next.
Yeah.
It's a pretty touchy time.
Yeah, that's it. And to his credit, Johnson's going to preside with some dignity over Lincoln's funeral, and he is going to establish a military tribunal to try the assassination conspirators. 4 of them, including Atzerodt, sentenced to death by hanging. Johnson placed a $100,000 bounty on Jefferson Davis, who's been a fugitive since the end of the war.
He's on the run.
That's it. And in North Carolina, under General William Tecumseh Sherman, he's going to offer generous terms in exchange for the surrender of Confederate forces, including the stipulation that the Confederate state government could remain in power and private property rights, expressly here, including over slaves, it's going to be respected.
That's Sherman's generous offer for surrender of the Confederate Army in North Carolina. War Secretary Edwin Stanton is outraged by this, thinks Sherman has exceeded his authority as a military commander, making political concessions that he has no business making. Johnson's going to agree with Stanton on this one, and he sends General Ulysses Grant to North Carolina to walk back Sherman's armistice. And then you got Johnson meeting with powerful Republican senators like Charles Sumner and Benjamin Wade, leaders of what will become known as the Radical Republicans, and they leave the White House believing that Johnson might support voting rights for the freedmen. First couple months here, Johnson, you know, his popularity's pretty high. Seemed like he might be up to the task. Yeah. And it was pretty much all downhill from there.
Yeah, that's it.
Because we're faced with Reconstruction here.
Yeah.
And that's a term that was used at the time for, you know, how are we going to rebuild the country? Bring the South back into the fold? What is the new order going to be?
Yeah, we've talked before about the fact that, okay, we've won the war, now we need to win the peace. And this is the biggest example of winning the peace becoming another war in and of itself.
Mm-hmm.
Reconstruction, it basically is the second Civil War, or a continuation of the Civil War.
Yeah. It's trying to figure out what was the war supposed to be about. What does it mean? What has to change, and what might be able to stay the same?
Yeah.
And this really kind of falls in Johnson's lap, because the thing is, Congress went out of session on March 11th,
right,
while Lincoln was still in office. And it doesn't come back until December. At the time, Congress was, under normal circumstances, was only in session from December through March.
Mm-hmm.
They don't want any part of the hot Washington, D.C. summers that,
that did in Zachary Taylor.
Right. But at this time, I mean, that seems, the Civil War just ended. Lots of shit needs to be decided, and Congress is not around.
It's a pretty weird situation.
Yeah.
And, Johnson comes in there and is like, well,
Yeah, because during the war, Lincoln did a lot of things under basically emergency military power.
Right.
You can boss the South around because you're the commander-in-chief during wartime, but now that the war is ended...
Yeah, the war is effectively over now.
Yeah, there's kind of a question about where the authority to do anything comes from, and it's not really clear. Because Lincoln was using emergency war powers. What's Johnson going to do? And when Congress is even around, what power does it have over the internal affairs of the states? Well, that's it,
because even some of, and we've talked about it, some of Lincoln's emergency war measures came under pretty harsh scrutiny and were questioned as to their legality or their constitutionality.
Yeah.
One thing you're going to learn about Andrew Johnson is he's constantly hearkening to the Constitution. Andy Johnson's interpretation of the Constitution.
Yeah.
I suppose we should say. Now, Johnson has had over 9 months to tackle Reconstruction unfettered by congressional interference.
Yeah, he's really going to take advantage of this time between April and December, before Congress gets to come in and have a say. He wants to do it his way and set the tone.
That's it.
And what a tone he's going to set.
Yeah.
One that will haunt the nation for maybe a century or more.
Yeah, pretty well. It's not even funny. I don't know why I'm laughing. Yeah, that is what's going to happen. Yes. Johnson calls for, let's restore the southern states quick. Let's do it fast. He believes in Lincoln's theory that because secession is illegal, the southern states hadn't actually really left. They weren't their own nation. They were states in rebellion. Mm-hmm. They were never a separate nation.
Yeah.
So...
now maybe they're not really in rebellion anymore. What do we need to do other than, administer those loyalty oaths like he was doing in Tennessee?
Yeah.
Maybe not too much. Because that's kind of what Lincoln's plan was calling for.
Yeah. It was. And so Lincoln's plan and Johnson's plan, what's really the big difference here?
Well, I mean, part of the difference is there's no more war anymore, and the South is totally at the mercy of the North.
Yeah. And you got to figure Johnson initially has the support of Lincoln's cabinet.
Mm-hmm.
So his desire to act swiftly to just try and, you're no longer under rebellion.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know that he would have looked at it as welcome back to the United States. I think it was probably more like, all right, these states are no longer in a state of active rebellion.
Yeah. Yeah, and they need people who are sworn with loyalty to the United States to run their state governments. In his first couple moves, Lincoln's cabinet is with him, he recognizes the pro-union government of Virginia, and this is like a legitimately pro-union government,
right,
led by people who never were part of the Confederacy, which, I mean, doesn't necessarily have the support of a lot of people in Virginia.
Yeah.
But it's recognized.
Yeah.
Yeah, and Johnson, he proclaimed a general amnesty for former Confederates who take a loyalty oath, excluding Confederate government officials, high-ranking military officers, and anyone worth over $20,000. All of those people would have to apply for their own separate pardons.
Yeah.
So they're basically letting all the low-level people off the hook, which Johnson was all about, hang the traitors. He's probably not thinking about the rank and file like that. He wants Jefferson Davis's head.
Mm-hmm.
Regular people.
And in terms of the latter, the people worth $20,000 or more, that is pretty much Johnson being like,
all those people who thought you were better than me.
Yeah, you thought you were better than me. Bitch, get on your hands and knees and beg for mercy, because Andy Johnson's a-coming for you.
Yeah. Yeah, so now...
I think that was like a self-gratifying, move. More than... I don't know. I feel like Johnson's the kind of character that he got a kick out of that.
Yeah.
I think he liked that.
Yeah, but in the next year, he is going to issue over 12,000 individual pardons for people who applied, under those exceptions. Yeah, I'm sure he got a kick out of that. And he also, he has his eye on being elected president.
Sure.
In 1868, and knows he needs the support of Southern Democrats, people who'd seen him as a traitor to the South.
That's right. Yeah. He would have to have a pretty big conversion to get Southern Democrats on his side, because Southern Democrats from the time that he didn't join them in resigning their posts have looked at him as a traitor.
Yeah.
So now he's going to need to get them on his side, because you got to think about it, 1864, these southern states weren't involved in the election with Lincoln and McClellan. Mm-hmm. Now we got them coming back into the fold.
Yeah. Andy Johnson, he could be the compromised presidential candidate between North and South in 68 if things go his way.
Right.
If they don't, maybe the North and the South will both see him as a traitor for different reasons.
Yeah.
Well, he's going to start appointing governors in southern states, ordering them to hold constitutional conventions to establish new state governments. And this is where he's kind of like, he's letting them do this without a lot of strings attached.
Right.
Because a lot of Republicans feel like the federal government should be using its leverage now to force major changes in the South. The radical Republicans want to redistribute land, all that plantation land, give it out to freedmen, really cut the knees out of the rich planter class.
Yeah, like look at what Thaddeus Stevens wanted to do. People like that.
Yeah, this is the time to force southern states to grant black suffrage and equal rights to freedmen. There are huge populations that are now of slaves that are now free in places like South Carolina and I think Mississippi. They're a majority of the population.
Yeah, and what does that give the Republicans? Political power in the South, potentially.
If black people can vote.
Yeah.
But that's the issue now, because Lincoln, right at the end of his life, for the first time publicly spoke in favor of voting rights for some African Americans.
Yeah, and that was the speech that John Wilkes Booth said would be his last.
Yep. John Wilkes Booth heard that, and that was the last straw, which is a big, sticking point for a lot of people. But hey, here's the thing. Now that slavery is abolished, all those former slaves that had been counted under the 3/5 clause for representation in the House and the Electoral College, they're not going to be fully counted. So southern states will increase their representation in the federal government. And if black people aren't voting, that means white Southerners will have even more power in the federal government than they had before.
Yeah.
And here's the thing. In a majority of northern states at this time, black people are not allowed to vote.
Right.
In the North. And that's not just like an old relic. In 1865, 3 northern states specifically reject black suffrage by huge margins.
Yeah.
So it's not, I mean, it's not like a no-brainer that you force South Carolina to let black people vote when most northern states are not letting them
do that.
I mean, the populations of black people in the North are small enough that they're not going to tip the political balance as much. But
any newly freed person of color that is heading to the North to enjoy their newfound freedom is going to be in for a hard reality.
Yeah. Well, yeah, they're in for a hard reality everywhere. But yeah, that's probably, I mean, that's a reason why, you know, Republicans can't necessarily claim like a moral no-brainer over Andy Johnson. Like, hey, it's obvious that black people should be allowed to vote, when look around the North and Northerners don't think they're equal. And, Andy Johnson probably takes a cynical...
the ones that do are still like a quote-unquote radical minority.
Mm-hmm. Andy Johnson probably takes, you know, a cynical view. Yeah, Republicans would love if black people voted, because that means white Republicans would win all the congressional seats in the South.
Yeah.
And if black people don't vote, then white Democrats will win.
Yeah.
And those are more Andy Johnson's speed.
Yeah.
And then there's, you know, Johnson and even William Seward, Secretary of State, argue that, hey, the issue of who is allowed to vote has always been a state issue. The federal government shouldn't intervene in Southern voting rights, particularly because it's not intervening in Northern voting rights.
Yeah, William Seward standing up for states' rights.
Yep. Yes. Seward, I mean, he stood by Johnson.
Yeah.
Johnson kind of let him control foreign policy, and really throughout, like, Seward kind of maintained that Johnson was following the Lincoln plan of
I think Johnson
leniency.
felt that he had to follow the Lincoln plan if he had hopes of being reelected.
Yeah.
And, I mean...
Well, yeah.
I think initially here he is.
Well, that's what, you know, that's kind of the overall plan, but I think the argument would be that Lincoln's plan would have changed when he saw how things were going.
Yeah.
Because, I mean, Johnson's view, Johnson thinks, you know, everything should go back to the way it was.
Well,
he
wants to restore, like, the antebellum standards.
Yeah, everything should be the same, but without slavery.
Right.
And so when he just lets Southerners recreate their own state governments, they're emboldened to take power back and start treating the freedmen as slaves in all but name.
Yeah. And this is where you get into one of the real dark chapters in American history.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because when Johnson, who runs the federal government at this time, like, takes his hands-off approach on the South, they look around and say, okay, we're going to do things our way.
Yeah.
And Mississippi enacts the quote-unquote Black Code.
Yeah.
Which becomes the model, and within that year, all the southern states will enact black codes.
Yeah, and these are going to bar people of color from renting land outside of cities, which prevents them from becoming independent farmers. They are required to present each January proof of employment for the year. They could be arrested for vagrancy and lose their entire year's wages if they leave their employment during the year. Basically, they're forced to hire themselves out to former slave masters, and they're not allowed to leave their jobs. Among other restrictions, no liquor, can't carry any weapons.
Yeah, sounds pretty much exactly like slavery.
Yeah. And violence against freedmen in the South is going to soar. Hundreds being murdered for no reason by whites who would never face prosecution. We got some really despicable shit going on here.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, things really degenerate. Because this is the time period where, you know, the victorious Union Army could have forced the southern states at gunpoint to do whatever they wanted.
Mm-hmm.
One thing I read, a quote, I think it was from 1870, that a former top Confederate official said that at this moment the Confederacy was so destroyed and so just at the mercy of the Union, that the Union could have imposed any terms and they would have been forced to accept them.
Yeah.
But when Johnson gives them these lenient terms, then that's what they want.
They take them and run with them.
And even when Johnson, when Congress comes back and tries to walk back what Johnson's doing, the South doesn't accept that now, because Johnson gave them the standard by which they think they should live.
Yeah.
And that's what they're going to spend the next 100 years, thinking they're entitled to.
Yeah. And, we talked about violence. The Klan's going to come up.
Mm-hmm.
The Birth of a Nation. D.W. Griffith. The quote-unquote immortal classic of cinema.
Yep.
With the heroic Klansman riding into the defense of the poor white Southerners who are being overrun by the savage darkies. Now,
history written in lightning.
As President Wilson, a shit historian himself, described it.
Yeah.
Now, that film gives you an idea of what white people at the turn of the century thought about this.
Mm-hmm.
And that's kind of like an average. That was a popular film.
Oh, yeah.
And in North and South.
Mm-hmm.
There were people that cried out against it, yeah, and a lot of them. But the fact that so many people looked at that as being like, yeah, wow, the good old days, is pretty fucked.
Yep. Well,
and that's where we're at.
That all started in the 9 months of Andy Johnson's presidential Reconstruction, when he was on his own. And then
we're gonna Reconstruction. We're definitely gonna have an episode on it as a standalone when we start branching out post presidential episodes. But boy, what a thing! Because Congress is gonna come back, and shit's gonna hit the fan.
Yep. Yeah, December 1865. You got newly recognized governments in North and South Carolina, Alabama, and Georgia ratifying the 13th Amendment that abolishes slavery. It's now, for the first time, an official part of the Constitution. Yeah. And all the southern states, with the new state governments set up under Andy Johnson's Reconstruction, they're going to send senators and representatives to the new Congress.
Yeah.
A lot of them are former rebels. One of them is ex-Confederate Vice President Alexander Stephens.
Yeah.
Who is chosen to represent Georgia in the Senate.
The former Vice President of the Confederate States of America, within months of the end of the war, representing Georgia in the United States Senate.
Well, not so fast. Well, the Constitution gives each House of Congress the exclusive right to judge the qualifications of its own members, and the northern members of Congress refuse to recognize the new members from the South, refuse to give them their seats. The 11 former Confederate states are excluded from Congress. Republicans are going to control over 70% of the actual seated seats in both houses. And Congress is going to try to take over from Andrew Johnson.
Yeah. You got Representative Thaddeus Stevens of Pennsylvania. He considered Lincoln's theory that the southern states had never actually left to be a quote-unquote metaphysical question. He believed that, as a practical matter, the South had obviously left. Now that the South had been conquered, it should be treated as federal territory under the jurisdiction of Congress, which should decide the terms on which these rebel southern states could rejoin the Union.
Yeah, I mean, that's Thaddeus Stevens' idea of, where does the constitutional authority to do Reconstruction come from? How do you treat these states? Because if they're states, they have states' rights.
Yeah.
Congress can't tell a state who its governor should be under normal circumstances.
Right.
But these aren't normal circumstances.
Yeah.
Thaddeus Stevens thinks they ought to be treated like federal territories.
Right.
And, there's no real easy
and thereby
answer.
they don't have, quote-unquote, states' rights.
Yeah. There's no easy answer to that question of how to do this.
Yeah.
Because the Constitution doesn't really, anticipate this.
No.
It has the Republican form of government clause, which says that the United States will guarantee to each state a Republican form of government, which, theoretically would mean that if, somebody declared himself, king of Pennsylvania and wants to pass on the crown to his son, that the federal government could overthrow him.
Yeah.
But it says that the United States shall do that. Doesn't differentiate between who out of president or Congress would take the lead.
Yeah.
And here's the problem. A Republican form of government, that means what? A government by representatives of the people, and a large amount of those people are Confederate rebels.
Yeah.
And Thaddeus Stevens says, we don't want to hear from you. We don't want your representatives. So that's also a tough question. You want these states to be part of the United States? This was supposed to be a democracy, and look what the people down there did and believe in. Is this what you want to invite back into the federal government?
Yep.
Not an easy question.
No, it's not. The House and Senate are going to establish a 15-member joint committee on Reconstruction aimed at wresting control of Reconstruction away from President Johnson. Now, they've come back and they're like, whoa, okay, we need to take a couple steps back here.
Mm-hmm.
And so this is what they're setting out to do. They're going to pass a bill extending the Freedmen's Bureau. This had been established under Lincoln, but it was set to expire. Now, what did the Freedmen's Bureau do? It helped freedmen with day-to-day issues like obtaining food and jobs, and served as legal advocates for their fair treatment.
Yeah, this is supposed to be like the federal agency that will speak for freedmen against white Southerners.
Right. It's set to expire, and what's Johnson going to do? Well, he's going to veto the extension of the Freedmen's Bureau.
Yep, Congress tried to override that veto, and they didn't quite get there. And Johnson felt like he had the radical Republicans by the balls.
Yeah.
Like he had just defeated them, and now moderate Republicans are going to be forced to support him.
Right. The truth was a little bit more complicated, I suppose.
Yeah, because, these moderates, they're not as enthusiastic as the radicals about equal rights for freedmen.
No.
These are, they don't believe black people are equal. They don't really,
No, they really don't, but they want,
They want a little bit of fairness here, because with the black codes and stuff, it just went, way too far. Immediately, it was just beyond the pale for moderates to accept. They're not just going to abandon all these freedmen to the black codes and just basically let the clock be turned back to slavery.
Right.
So they're not going to line up behind Johnson. And then in February 1866, Johnson's going to give a speech on Washington's birthday, which is supposed to celebrate President Washington.
Yeah.
In his speech. I think he mentioned himself like 200 times.
Right, yeah, he mentions Washington like 6 or 7 times and mentions himself like 260 sometimes, something like that. So there's, we talked about a little bit about Johnson's debate temperament earlier, and I made a comparison to 45. Well, here's another one. He's the kind of guy that on a day that's supposed to celebrate, in this case, George Washington, but, you could substitute that with any event and turn it around to himself.
Yeah, he said that radical Republicans were opposed to the Union, and he accused them of plotting to assassinate him.
Pretty bold.
And Republicans pretty much viewed this speech as a declaration of war.
Yeah.
And they're going to fight back.
That's right. In March, Congress is going to pass the Civil Rights Act of 1866, which invalidates the Black Codes and grants freedmen citizenship and the same civil rights and property rights as white people. Johnson, of course, is going to veto that, and he argues that it discriminated against whites in favor of blacks and gave citizenship to freedmen while southern states remained unrepresented in Congress.
Yeah, Johnson is going to use, those 11 southern states, Congress rejected them, did not seat their members. And Johnson is really going to harp on that. And basically, that's part of his view that this Congress that's facing him is illegitimate because it doesn't actually represent all the states.
Yeah.
But Congress is going to override his veto on the Civil Rights Act. And that's the first time in American history that a major substantive law was passed over the president's veto. And that's going to become a trend because Congress is going to repass that Freedmen's Bureau Act, and this time they're going to override the veto on it.
Yeah.
They're going their own way. In June, Congress passed the 14th Amendment to the Constitution, which would constitutionalize the protections of the Civil Rights Act and give Congress authority to enforce them against the states.
Yeah.
It stopped short of guaranteeing black voting rights, but it would proportionately reduce a state's representation in the House and Electoral College if it denied black voting rights. And while the president has no role in constitutional amendments, Johnson opposes the 14th. Congress personally embarrassed him by readmitting Tennessee's congressman to Congress just as soon as Tennessee ratified the 14th Amendment.
Yeah.
It's not going to be till July of 1868, though, that the 14th Amendment will become part of the Constitution.
Right. But they're getting his heckles up.
Yep.
With that one.
Johnson is going to fight back in the war against Congress.
Yeah. He's going to...
You got elections coming up.
That's it. And he wants to get reelected, of course. So he's going to embark on the swing around the circle. You may have heard about Ring Around the Rosie, but wait till you try swinging around the circle.
Yeah, the congressional elections in fall 1866, Johnson thinks that they will vindicate him. That if the people choose his approach over the radical Republican approach, that he will win support in Congress and, he'll win his battle against Congress that way.
Yeah.
So he's going to do something pretty much unprecedented and go on a big campaign tour.
That's it. And also unprecedented, he's going to compare himself to Jesus Christ and blame radical Republicans for the New Orleans massacre in which a white mob attacked a peaceful black demonstration and killed up to 50 people.
That sounds like it's probably radical Republicans' fault.
Oof.
Obviously. At one speech in Cleveland, a heckler yelled, "Hang Jeff Davis," and Johnson responded by saying, "Why don't you hang Thad Stevens and Wendell Phillips?"
Those very fine people on both sides.
Radical Republicans should be hanged, maybe? A supporter reminded Johnson to maintain his dignity, and he said, I don't care about my dignity.
Well, at least he admits that.
That was a remark that was widely reported. And speaking of dignity, many thought his tour was beneath the dignity of the presidency.
Yeah, that leads to even the New York Herald, a pro-Johnson newspaper, saying, quote, "It is mortifying to see a man occupying the lofty position of President of the United States descend from that position and join issue with those who are dragging their garments in the muddy gutters of political vituperation." The tour is going to leave Johnson with less support in the North than he started with, and the 1866 elections are going to prove a landslide victory for Republicans who increased their already huge majorities in both houses of Congress.
Yep. And Thaddeus Stevens, who is not going to be hanged, instead he's going to take advantage and introduce the Reconstruction Act, which is going to dissolve the southern state governments established under Johnson's authority and require those states to hold new constitutional conventions where freedmen would be allowed to vote and become delegates and former Confederates would not.
Yeah.
The South is going to be divided into 5 military districts under the immediate control of the Union Army, and Southern states will not be readmitted to the Union until they ratify the 14th Amendment. That's the radical Republican counterplan.
Yeah. Of course, naturally, Johnson is going to veto the bill, and Congress is promptly going to override him. Now, at Johnson's behest...
Yeah, he's not going to lay down for the radical Republican plan.
No. At his behest, the Attorney General narrowly interprets the protections Congress grants to freedmen and restrictions imposed on former rebels. Johnson is going to remove Union Army commanders who are enthusiastic about enforcing congressional Reconstruction, and he's going to replace them with men who are more than happy to leave Southerners to their own devices.
So what is Congress left to do?
Well, basically, we got a war going on between Congress and Johnson at this point.
Mm-hmm. And what is the most powerful weapon in the congressional arsenal to use against the president? One that had never been used before.
That's right. It had been talked about, but never seriously considered. Until now. It's the I word.
It's time to consider impeachment.
Yeah.
And people started considering impeachment on Johnson pretty early. In December 1866, Representative James Ashley, who believed in a conspiracy theory that Johnson was involved in the Lincoln assassination, he moved to open an inquiry. Republican moderates rejected this motion, still hoping for an opportunity to work with Johnson. Although in January 1867, the House was ready to vote to open an inquiry into allegedly corrupt abuse of the pardon, veto, and appointment powers.
Yeah, because Johnson is using these pretty liberally.
Yeah, I mean, he's thrown his weight around, but, you know, that's the thing. Doesn't the Constitution give the president power to pardon, veto, and appoint? I mean, those are kind of his powers.
Yeah.
House holds some closed-door hearings, and then the Judiciary Committee votes 5-4 against sending impeachment articles to the House. That's a committee of 7 Republicans and 2 Democrats.
Yeah.
Although in November, one of those Republicans changes his mind, and the committee votes 5-4 in favor of impeachment, but the full House is going to reject 108-57 pursuing impeachment at that time.
Yeah.
Because there were 2 views of impeachment. There's a narrow view that holds that the, quote, high crimes and misdemeanors required for impeachment had to be specific indictable crimes.
Right.
And then there's a broad view that says impeachment is not a judicial but a political proceeding, and that officials could be impeached for abuses of power even without specific crimes. So that's like, we don't like how he's using his pardon, veto, and appointment powers.
And we're going to get him out of here.
Yeah. Well, that view doesn't really win a majority of the House in 1867, but there's a new crime out there that we might be able to accuse Johnson of committing.
That's it. They pretty much set him up here.
Yeah.
They want to get rid of him. They want to make it legal, of course, and constitutional. So, how could they entrap Johnson?
Well, they didn't like how he was using his appointment powers. In March of 1867, they passed over his veto the Tenure of Office Act, which purports to require the president to obtain Senate approval to dismiss executive officers that had been appointed with the advice and consent of the Senate.
No, just straight up, is this bullshit? I mean, this hasn't been something ever required of the president.
Well, it's not. I mean, there was debate about this at the beginning when Washington was president, because the Constitution is silent on whether the president can dismiss the cabinet or not. Mm-hmm. And at the time, I mean, of course, you got George Washington in there. No one's going to stand against him.
No, nobody's really going to second guess Washington.
Yeah, and I think even under John Adams, I mean, because he fired Timothy Pickering as Secretary of State and no one batted an eye. Mm-mm. It was pretty much, established that the president could fire. I mean, up until this point, presidents have been firing people as much as they wanted.
Sure.
But Congress didn't really... Now Congress is saying they can't, and we'll see what happens. Part of the Tenure of Office Act, if the Senate is not in session at the time, the president can suspend an officer and let an interim officer serve until the Senate reconvenes and decides whether to accept the dismissal. And Congress explicitly makes it a crime to violate the Tenure of Office Act.
Yeah.
And puts like $10,000 fines and stuff in there.
Yeah.
So Johnson's ability to use his control over the military to interfere with congressional Reconstruction, it's hampered a bit because War Secretary Edwin Stanton is a radical Republican who hates Johnson.
Yeah.
And he refuses to resign and continues to thwart the president from inside the administration.
Yeah. So how's Johnson going to deal with Stanton? Well, he waits till August 1867 when Congress is out of session and suspends him and names General Grant interim war secretary. Now, in December, the Senate is going to vote not to accept Stanton's dismissal. That puts Grant in a bit of a pickle.
Yeah.
An awkward position.
He's like, presumptively in line to get the Republican nomination.
That's right.
He's very popular. He doesn't want to get tied up in this shit.
Ulysses S. Grant is the man that saved the Union.
Yeah. And if he doesn't turn over the keys to the War Department to Edwin Stanton, he's technically committing a crime and could be liable for $10,000 fines. Mm-hmm. So Grant tells Johnson that he's going to resign because he doesn't want to be involved in this. And there's some conversation where Johnson kind of thought that Grant had agreed to stick around until a new replacement could be appointed, someone that maybe the Senate would accept over Stanton. But when the Senate voted to restore Stanton, Grant resigned immediately.
Yeah, he's like, I'm out.
He handed over the keys, and Johnson ended up feeling like Grant betrayed him, and the two of them will hate each other after this point.
Well... what a situation,
One way out of this for Johnson is if he could get someone else to serve as war secretary who the Senate would approve of. And he's going to ask General William Tecumseh Sherman, second only to Grant in esteem in the North. But he's also someone who is pretty sympathetic toward white Southerners. He was absolutely unmerciful as a military commander, but now that the war's over, he's not a radical Republican.
No. And really, he's kind of apolitical in a sense. He doesn't want to get involved in politics at all.
Yeah, he said,
He leaves that to his brother, John, and says, no,
yeah,
I'm not interested.
Yeah, and he's not going to do anything to
perhaps, put his friendship with Grant in jeopardy.
Right.
Because they've become close. He doesn't want to upset Grant. And so he's just like, nah, I don't want involved in this. So Johnson turns to Lorenzo Thomas. You all know Lorenzo Thomas, of course.
Well, the thing is, no one knows Lorenzo Thomas. And Johnson, here's the thing, he's given up on trying to find someone that the Senate will accept and replace Stanton with. So he just straight up fires Stanton. He said,
right.
Lorenzo Thomas is the Adjutant General of the Army. Johnson says, you're the interim Secretary of War. Go hand Stanton this note that says you're fired and take control of the War Department. And he goes over there, and Stanton refuses to recognize his authority, doesn't give him the War Department, and actually has Thomas arrested for violating the Tenure of Office Act.
Yeah. Yeah. Stanton's holed up in the War Department. He's got him barricaded himself in.
Yeah, this was kind of crazy. I mean,
this is a showdown. This is serious shit.
Because Congress is calling Johnson a usurper and a dictator.
There are political cartoons of him as a Roman emperor during this period.
But here's the thing, what's going on here is almost it's a potential coup d'etat in a way. You got one military officer come into the War Department demanding control, and someone else says no. And there was the Grand Army of the Republic was the veterans organization.
Right.
That is around at this time of people who are not active duty but they're basically like a paramilitary force. And one of the radical members of Congress is the head of the Grand Army of the Republic, and he's got people guarding the War Office.
Yeah.
So there's Congress almost has its own rival military force to protect the War Office against...
And to oppose the president, basically.
And you got General Grant, who's very popular and doesn't want any part of this.
Yeah.
If someone else was in charge of the Army, what if Johnson ordered the Army to take the War Department from Stanton? And this is all on the basis...
And there are probably some Union officers that might have considered it.
Yeah. And this is all over, the Tenure of Office Act, which is questionably constitutional at best and is barely worth the paper it's printed on, but that's what this showdown is over.
Yeah, so here we are. And 3 days after Johnson dismisses Stanton, the House of Representatives is going to vote to impeach him by a vote of 126 to 47.
So the Tenure of Office Act violation was the crime that Congress was waiting for, and the House is going to approve 11 articles of impeachment. 8 of them are about violating the Tenure of Office Act. 1 is for alleged violation of an 1867 law that purported to require the president to go through the General of the Army, who was Grant, to issue military orders. 1 was for making inflammatory and scandalous threats against Congress, and then 1 was a catch-all article that encompassed the Tenure of Office Act violations and Johnson's other allegedly unconstitutional challenges to Congress's authority.
Yeah. Congress had set out their snare, and Johnson's foot was fully entangled now.
Oh, yeah.
How could he hope to challenge the constitutionality of the Tenure of Office Act in the Supreme Court?
Well, there's only one way to get to the case to the Supreme Court now, in time to get a ruling, and that is by challenging Stanton's arrest of Lorenzo Thomas for violating the act. And Stanton dropped that case against Thomas to prevent it from being challenged in the Supreme Court.
Yeah. Some move by Stanton.
Yeah. The House is going to appoint 7 managers to handle the prosecution in the Senate, including the Union General and former Democrat Benjamin Butler.
Beast.
He was one of the guys considered as a possible running mate for Lincoln in 1864. And then you got Thaddeus Stevens, who is really the, leader of this whole deal, but he's pretty old and he's in very poor health at this time.
Yeah, he's not doing too great at this point. And Johnson's defense team is going to be led by former Supreme Court Justice Benjamin Curtis, Attorney General Henry Stanbury, and future Attorney General William Evarts. Now, the Senate, of course, is going to need a 2/3 vote in favor of conviction. All 9 Democrats and 3 pro-Johnson Republicans, they're considered solid acquittal votes. But Johnson's going to need at least 7 more Republicans to acquit if he's going to survive in office. I'm thinking of Spielberg's Lincoln and that story of trying to convince people to vote in such a way, and how there could easily be an Andy Johnson sequel where Johnson tries to get people to support him.
Yeah, it's the same thing and the same people involved.
Yeah.
Now, at this time, the president pro tempore of the Senate is first in line of presidential succession after the vice president.
Right.
Now it's the Speaker of the House, but at the time, President pro tempore of the Senate, and that means that Senator Benjamin Wade of Ohio will become president if Johnson is removed.
Yeah.
And that's not really helping the impeacher's cause.
That's it. It doesn't really sit well with everybody.
Yeah, because Wade is an extreme radical who alienated many moderate Republicans with his positions on certain issues. He favors high tariffs, soft money, and he even supports the ridiculously unthinkable cause of women's suffrage.
Yeah.
It's like, we don't like Andy Johnson, but
Ben Wade?
wow. And here, this is happening with only a year left in Johnson's term.
Right.
So it's pretty obvious that Ulysses Grant is going to be president a year from now.
Yeah.
And, moderates aren't really crazy about Ben Wade. But while this whole impeachment thing is going on, you got all kind of office seekers angling for what patronage appointments they're going to get in the Wade administration.
Yeah. Well, people are people.
There's a lot of patronage promises going on both sides of this deal as to who's going to vote for impeachment or not.
That's it.
But hey, we got to have a trial to go through the motions of.
Yeah. And what a trial. You want to talk about, like, a main event, like a huge prize fight or a Super Bowl or any college bowl. It's the impeachment of Andy Johnson. It's the hottest ticket.
Yeah. Yeah, the Senate chamber is packed.
Oh, man. They're selling out.
Yeah.
The capacity crowd here going wild. You could cut the electricity with a knife.
Yeah, but the spectacle, the trial is maybe not as entertaining as people hoped.
No, most people find it incredibly boring because it's totally over their heads.
Yeah, well, first of all, there's very lengthy opening statements from the teams of lawyers on both sides. And this is a time in history where going to watch a guy speak for like 2 or 3 hours was entertainment.
Yeah.
This is like pushing the patience of crowds.
Yeah, this is borderline, you think of an 8-hour workday. Well, you're getting there here. These are like really lengthy monologues that are really, really heavily seasoned with legal language that the layman is just not going to get.
Yeah. And then you got witnesses coming in to testify when, like, everybody pretty much already knows what happened here as a factual matter.
Yeah.
But you got these witnesses, and then there's all this time spent debating, like, evidentiary questions, and the full Senate is voting to decide each objection. Because someone suggested, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court is presiding over this trial. Someone suggested, why doesn't he rule on objections? And then if the Senate wants to overrule him as a whole, it can do that. And they said, no, the full Senate will debate every objection.
Yeah.
So there'll be like an hour-long, someone will ask a question, then there'll be like an hour-long debate.
Yeah.
They'll decide, okay, you can ask that question, and then the answer will be irrelevant anyway.
What was the question?
And then after the testimony, you had 10 straight days of closing arguments made by the lawyers. And then the Senate, it schedules its vote for a month later. And that's going to be the main event. That's really going to be when everyone is on the edge of their seats.
Yeah, and both times have a month to lobby and hard.
Mm-hmm.
And they do.
Johnson needs to get 7 more votes. The impeachers need to make sure he doesn't get more than 6. And there's like a small handful of Republican senators that are considered, up for grabs.
Yeah, and Johnson figures, well, I mean, there's probably a couple ways I can convince some of these people on the fence to come my way. Well, for one, I could promise to stop interfering in Reconstruction.
Yeah, that's the thing. Once this whole impeachment deal started, Johnson kind of like calmed down a bit. He didn't commit any new like outrageous challenges.
Right.
And some people are thinking like he's only got a year left. Mm-hmm. If he's going to like relax, then we can just like wait this out.
And I think it's kind of safe to say that even like before the point that we're at right now, Johnson kind of knew that he's not going to get nominated in his own right.
Well,
if he had hoped for it, I think that before this point, he figured it's not going to happen.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think Senate Republicans definitely know it's not going to happen.
Yeah.
And for him, just like hanging on is more important than anything. Right. So he lets a couple moderate Republicans know that he's, going to stop interfering with Reconstruction, that he's going to nominate General John Schofield as War Secretary, and he's a guy that the moderates like. And that gets a couple moderates on board. You also got a very active betting market.
Yeah.
A lot of wagers going around.
Yeah.
And there's a question about whether this betting market is part of, possible corruption and bribery. Like, that's a way you can bribe a senator, is to basically say, have your friend bet on acquittal.
Yeah.
And then when you vote for acquittal, that bet will be paid off, and maybe you can get your hands on that money.
Yeah. Yeah.
We'll talk about that in a second. Because when it comes time to vote, it's May 16th. And the first thing they vote on, it's going to come down to it. They put up the 11th article, which is the catch-all article. That's the one that has the best chance. It's all going to come down to this one vote.
Yeah.
And as the roll call is being called, like, they don't know who's going to win.
Yeah.
It's coming down to the wire. And when they get to Senator Edmund Ross of Kansas, both sides think they have him.
Yeah.
And he votes to acquit.
Right. It ends up 35-19, exactly one vote short of conviction. And Edmund Ross is going to write about this in his diary, in his recollections, and basically he said whatever his feelings personally on Andrew Johnson, he didn't want to be the guy that was responsible for the first presidential removal.
Mm-hmm.
because he'd be forever associated with it. Well, Edmund Ross of Kansas, the man who voted to kick out tyrant Andy Johnson.
Mm-hmm. Well, he's still associated with it.
He is.
Him and the handful of other Republicans who voted to acquit, they say they choose, principle over politics and did, the right thing to not aid and abet the radical Republicans in their, political assassination of Johnson over, a technical violation of a law that's probably not even constitutional.
Well, that's it.
But the thing is, after this, Senator Edmund Ross got very significant patronage tossed his way by the Johnson administration. And that, I don't really think there's anything wrong with that, because Thaddeus Stevens on the other side, started this whole thing on the grounds that impeachment is a political process that you can, get rid of the president for, political abuse of power. I think the president can, approach it politically.
Yeah.
And there were plenty of people being promised jobs in the Benjamin Wade administration at the same time.
And again, Spielberg's Lincoln.
Yeah.
The guys that,
Mm-hmm. Yeah, maybe if you bribe people to vote for the 13th Amendment.
That's just an easy way to get, the average listener that may have seen that film. That's going on there. Mm-hmm. And this is really no different.
Well, there was maybe some more going on here. There was an investigation. Benjamin Butler, who was one of the lead House prosecutors, began an investigation into bribery. And there was a group of political operatives called the Astor House Group.
Yeah.
That was associated with the New York Democratic political boss, Thurlow Weed. And there was the Cincinnati lawyer, Charles Woolley, who represented the Whiskey Ring.
Yeah.
Now, these... there was over $100,000 that was raised to support Johnson's defense, ostensibly to pay his lawyers and stuff like that, although his legal bills were only ever a fraction of the amount raised, and no one really knows what happened to all the rest of that money.
Yeah.
A lot of it
That's a good question.
A lot of it came from political appointees who, in the classic political machine, party machine at the time, appointees kick back part of their salaries to the party, and a lot of that went into this. And then you got the Whiskey Ring, which there was a big whiskey tax at the time, and there was a huge, basically, scheme of bribing tax collectors to avoid paying the whiskey tax.
Yeah.
So these are a lot of people that have a huge patronage interest in Jack Johnson staying around.
That's right.
And there was a huge amount of money raised, and no one knows what happened to it, and particularly there was $20,000 withdrawn right before the final vote, that this one guy kind of had a very shady story about what happened to it. And, no one really knows. Charles Woolley was held in contempt of Congress, and he was held imprisoned in the Capitol building for several days while this investigation was going on, but nothing was ever proved. Part of the problem was that Benjamin Butler had basically tried to bribe one of these operatives into ratting out the bribery ring.
Yeah.
So him having done that kind of didn't look good.
Yeah. Butler has his own detractors.
Mm-hmm.
There's also, talk about political cartoons. There are some anti-Butlerism cartoons from this period, and
I read the book Impeached by David O. Stewart about this, and I think he concludes that you can't prove that there was any bribery, but it seems like there probably was.
Yeah, and probably on both sides.
Well, there were definitely a lot of patronage promises made on the Benjamin Wade side.
Sure.
Oh, yeah. One of the interesting things is right before this final vote, Benjamin Wade, at the beginning of the trial, some people objected to say, Benjamin Wade, you have a conflict of interest to participate in this trial because you're going to be president if he is convicted. And people said, no, he's a senator. Ohio has a right to have both of its senators here. And then right before the final vote, someone said, like, hey, why don't you resign as President pro tempore of the Senate? And that would put House Speaker Schuyler Colfax in line to be president. And he's more of a moderate that a lot more people liked. And the idea of him being president would have been a lot more acceptable to more people.
Yeah, it was a little more palatable.
But Wade said, no, I'm not doing that.
Yeah.
And whether that would have tipped the balance, who knows?
Yeah, it's hard to say.
A couple weeks after this happened, Schuyler Colfax would be chosen as vice presidential nominee under Grant.
That's right.
Not Ben Wade, who was considered as if he had become president here, that they probably would have made him vice presidential nominee.
Yeah.
But, yeah, they weren't as big of a fan of him after this.
No. Johnson is going to celebrate his acquittal with a whiskey toast, while Thaddeus Stevens is going to lament, quote, "The country is going to the devil." Now, the Tenure of Office Act is going to be gutted by amendments in 1869 and then fully repealed in 1887. In 1926, a similar law applying to postmasters was held unconstitutional by the Supreme Court in a majority opinion written by Chief Justice William Howard Taft.
Yep. Former president defending presidential power and saying the last word constitutionally on maybe what the Tenure of Office Act was about.
That's right.
One of the things that David O. Stewart concludes in his book is he thinks that he's felt, I guess, that it was kind of exaggerated that, you know, if they remove Johnson here, then it's going to become a thing that Congress does all the time. That it's going to make, you know, all presidents are going to be at the mercy of Congress.
Yeah.
And that, you know, that it's overblown to think that. But I think it's easy to say that when it failed. Who knows what would have happened? And I think one thing that he never considered that I think would have happened if Congress had removed Johnson for this is that they would not have been able to get rid of the Tenure of Office Act.
Right.
Even though probably everyone knows it's kind of bullshit. Mm-hmm. If they had politically assassinated a president for violating it, they couldn't just repeal it the next year.
No.
Like they ended up doing.
They'd be stuck with it.
They would have to stand on that and keep pretending like it was super important. And that is a huge violation of the separation of powers.
Sure. I mean, yeah, you're looking at a pretty big restriction of presidential power there. And who knows what that could have meant, really? Because we're going to be entering a period where presidential power is on the wane.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this Congress...
And congressional power is going to be beefy.
Yeah,
this contest is the beginning of that.
Yeah, I mean, Congress, they came one vote short of killing Andrew Johnson, but they're going to be throwing their weight around for the next couple decades like
That's
Congress
right.
ever has before. And, you know, it would have been even more drastic if they had gotten rid of Johnson.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, there are people that argue that in the span between Lincoln and Teddy Roosevelt, it's a series of weak presidents. Well, how weak could they have been had Johnson been removed?
Yeah. Yeah, I think part of it is that you had a very solidly Republican Congress most of that time, and mostly Republican presidents who were pretty cooperative. But yeah, this was a big constitutional showdown between Congress and the president that had a lot more far-reaching effects than the actual substantive policies they were fighting over at the time.
Yeah.
Like all the Reconstruction stuff in the South.
Yeah.
It's almost like two different battles going on.
It really is. It's a two-front war. Mm-hmm. And it really is a war. And it's going to continue in the next couple episodes. But did Johnson do anything else? What else does he have? What was Johnson's foreign policy? This is all pretty domestic.
Yeah.
Was his entire administration totally beleaguered with this? Was there any room for anything else, or was there anything else to Andrew Johnson's presidency?
Well, there's a couple interesting foreign policy issues that happened. You had France intervening in Mexico back in 1861. They set up a puppet emperor and sent troops to occupy Mexico.
Mexico's still having the same kind of problems they've been having.
Yeah. Well, if that sounds like a pretty blatant violation of the Monroe Doctrine to you, Americans agreed.
Yeah.
But they were a little too busy by the Civil War to do anything about it.
That's it.
But the Civil War ends. Americans can turn their eye to Mexico and start rattling their sabers about going to war against France.
Isn't it something that so soon after the Civil War?
Well, hey, we got a lot of highly trained soldiers. We got a lot of guns and ammo lying around.
But it just, boy, doesn't it seem crazy that so soon after the Civil War that there are people that want to threaten war against France.
Mm-hmm. Well, Secretary of State William Seward doesn't want to do that.
Nope.
And he uses some more quiet diplomacy to indicate to the French that their presence in the Western Hemisphere is unacceptable.
And Johnson is going to do the, shall we say, Johnson sudo. Mm-hmm. Going to do the Johnson thing, and he's going to favor a much more aggressive approach, but he'll acquiesce to Seward's wishes. France is going to suffer setbacks at the hands of Mexican Republicans throughout 1865 and 66 before fully withdrawing from Mexico in 1867. Now, that's south of the border.
Yep.
What's going on up north?
Well, it's cold up there.
It sure is. It's the location of Seward's icebox. That's right, Russia, worried that its colony of Alaska could be easily taken by the British, enters into negotiations with Seward to sell it. And, negotiations there were interrupted by civil war, but they're going to be renewed. And in 1867, Seward agrees to pay $7.2 million for Alaska. The Senate will ratify the purchase by a large margin. Now, at the time, this isn't universally popular. Hence, Seward's icebox. A lot of people just thought, wow, you threw away over $7 million for a hunk of, snowy wasteland.
Yeah. Well, it remained largely uninhabited until gold was discovered there in the 1890s. Later on, oil was discovered. Turned out to have some value.
That's it. I think Alaska more than paid for itself.
Oh, yeah. This kind of reminds me very much of the Louisiana Purchase. And that the sale was prompted by fear that the British would take it away for nothing.
Yeah.
Russia had just gotten out of the Crimean War with Britain among other powers.
Yep.
And like Louisiana, its territory of Alaska was kind of a financial drain.
Yeah.
It wasn't making money off of it, and it didn't want Britain on its border. The United States is a more palatable power.
Makes sense. Sell it off.
And we're happy to oblige and expand the Union even more.
That's it. Alaska is going to become a territory in 1912 and finally be admitted as the 49th state in 1959.
The Johnson administration also negotiated a treaty with Britain to settle the Alabama claims, which were reparations for damages caused by Confederate warships that were built by British shipbuilders.
That's right. Now, there was a little bit of intrigue going on with foreign powers during the Civil War, and, well, this is some of it here.
Yeah, but the Senate is going to totally ignore Johnson's proposed treaty, and there's going to end up being a better deal obtained during the Grant administration.
Yep, they're going to let that sit on the shelf for a little bit. So, we're coming around to 1868. Who are the Democrats?
Time.
That's it. Who are the Democrats going to nominate? Johnson, he's popular among white Southerners.
But he pretty much couldn't be more unpopular in the North.
Yeah.
He won his...
And he was never one that had, like, you know, total popularity to begin with.
No. I mean, he has a certain appeal to, you know, the common man.
Initially, he's, you know, despised as a traitor by the South, and he's considered suspicious by the North.
Yeah.
Then when he gets in there, their suspicion, in their eyes, is validated, and they outright loathe him. And Southerners warm up to him a little bit.
I mean...
But there's still those that consider him a traitor for his actions during the war.
Well, as far as Southern Democrats are concerned, it's not like they could get an outright ex-Confederate to become president.
Certainly not.
Johnson's the best...
He's the next best thing
they got. But the Democratic Party is a national party, and there are Northern Democrats involved.
Yeah.
They got their convention in New York. It's in July 1868. Johnson's coming off a couple months after he escaped removal from office. And he is a major contender. But you got Representative George Pendleton of Ohio, who was the 1864 Democratic vice presidential nominee. And then you got Union General Winfield Scott Hancock.
That's right.
On the first two ballots, Johnson polled in second place behind Pendleton. On the third ballot, Hancock pulled ahead of him, and then he steadily lost support as the convention deadlocked on other candidates. On the 22nd ballot, New York Governor Horatio Seymour was proposed as a compromise candidate and won the nomination. The Democratic Party platform is going to thank Johnson for his, quote, patriotic efforts in resisting the aggressions of Congress upon the constitutional rights of the state and the people. But Johnson was pissed.
Yeah.
He feels abandoned.
Yep.
Seymour is going to win over 47% of the popular vote in the general election, but he lost the Electoral College to Ulysses Grant, 214 to 80.
Yeah, pretty whopping. Horatio Seymour, he had his own kind of problems. A lot of people held him responsible for the draft riots in 1863 in New York that were pretty fucking serious.
Yep.
And yeah, it's just one of them things that kind of thing is not gonna fade from the public mindset.
It's not the Democratic Party's year.
Yeah, it's just it's really not their year.
And it's not going to be for a while.
Yeah, it really isn't.
They got some splaining to do.
That's right. So, Johnson, he's going to be out.
He's got a few more months of lame duck time left.
That's right. So, what's he going to do? He's going to start dishing out pardons.
Yeah, he pardoned some more people right before the Democratic convention, maybe kind of hoping to drum up some support for himself. But then on Christmas Day, 1868, he will become a racist Santa Claus.
That's right.
And pardon all the rest of the Southerners, including Jefferson Davis, who was under indictment for treason at the time. They kept pardoning people with exceptions that got narrower and narrower until now even Jefferson Davis is going to be up.
That's right. You'll recall our top 5 presidential pardons. Number 2.
Johnson pardoning Confederates.
Yeah.
And yeah, that's, again, whether or not Jefferson Davis should be hanged is a totally different question of whether, like, black people should have rights. And, you know, letting these officials, you know, escape criminal punishment and is one thing.
And like we said about the Whiskey Rebellion traitors, better that they weren't hung.
Yeah.
Late February 1869, Congress passes the 15th Amendment, which provides that, quote, "the right of the citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude." That would be fully ratified in 1870.
Well, that was, I think, passed maybe with a week or so left in Johnson's term.
Yeah.
And then he's down to his final days. His last morning in office, he's sitting in his office signing some final papers, and his cabinet's kind of like, "Hey, you want to head over to the inauguration?"
Yeah.
And they did not follow their advice.
Nope. No, Johnson and Grant, like we said, not getting along after the Stanton incident.
Mm-hmm.
Johnson, the third out of 4 presidents not to attend their successor's inauguration. Who were the other 3? If you've listened to our show, you know 2 of them. And if you're alive right now, you could name all 3.
Oh, yeah.
Hit us up in the comments, and maybe you could win a prize.
Well, Johnson's leaving the White House.
That's it. That's going to bring us to the end of the presidency, the turbulent presidency of Andrew Johnson.
Yeah, and we will talk about how he spent the rest of his life after these messages from our sponsors.
Thanks for listening.
The Dead Presidents Podcast is brought to you in part by Dr. Hastings Hall, whose surgery and dispensary is established for the certain, quick, and safe cure of private and venereal diseases. Dr. Hastings Hall informs his friends and the public generally that he has opened his surgery and dispensary at number 402 Montgomery Street, where he continues to give unremitting attention to the following diseases: syphilis in all its forms and stages, seminal weakness and all the horrid consequences of self-abuse, impotency, gonorrhea, gleat, stricture, sexual debility, nocturnal and diurnal emissions, inflammation of the bladder and kidneys, diseases of the back and loins, affection of the spermatic cord, acute and chronic inflammation of the seminal ducts, hypertrophy and atrophy of the testicles, irritable urethra, neuralgia of the testicle, morbid growth and cancer of the testicle, diseases of the ovary, catarrhal vulvitis, vesicovagina fistula, prolapsus of the vagina and uterus, hypertrophy of the breast, abscess in the lacteal tubes, sore nipples, acute and chronic inflammation of the breast, neuralgia and cancer of the breast, etc. Listeners, who among us hasn't suffered from one or more of these diseases at some point in our lives? We here at the Dead Presidents Podcast have frankly dealt with the majority of these ailments at one time or another. And we might not even be here right now if it weren't for Dr. Hastings Hall. I came down with a serious case of atrophied testicles just last week, but thanks to Dr. Hall, I'm already on the mend and was able to make it into the studio today. I wouldn't trust my private and venereal diseases to anyone else.
If I'm being honest, James, my nipples are a little sore right now. I'm thinking about hitting up Dr. Hall as soon as we wrap up this episode.
As well you should. Why sit around suffering with sore nipples, a prolapsed uterus, or an irritable urethra when Dr. Hall has the cure? Visit his surgery and dispensary at number 402 Montgomery Street today. Your distressed reproductive organs will thank you.
We're also proud to be sponsored by Sheriff S.E. Jordan, who publishes this important notice. $200 reward. I will give a reward of $200 for the apprehension and delivery of one Isaac Mize, who eloped from my residence on the 6th of February last, decoying off with him my wife, Mary E. Jordan, who left my bed and board without any cause known to me. Said Mize, besides decoying off my wife, appropriated my means to his own use, carrying off about $125 and leaving me bound for him to a considerable amount. He is about 22 years of age, 6 feet high, blue eyes, light hair, fair complexion, having quite a fine head of hair, his lips full, and mouth generally opened. He is frequently laughing and is easy to agree with anyone, having no fixed ideas of his own. Said Mize was a private in Company E, 1st Regiment Federal Alabama Cavalry, from which he holds a certificate of honorable discharge, of which he frequently boasts. I will give $200 for his apprehension, or I will give a liberal reward for any information that will lead to his whereabouts. My wife, Mary E. Jordan, is about 40 years of age, about 5 feet 4 inches high, blue eyes, light hair, fair complexion, front teeth decayed, and a considerable scar on her neck. Her general appearance is that of a high-toned lady. She weighs about 160 pounds. Any information relative to her will be thankfully received, and the informant liberally rewarded. All communications must be addressed to Sheriff S.E. Jordan, Randolph County, Alabama. Listeners, be on the lookout for the detestable, wife-stealing villain Isaac Mize. It shouldn't be too hard to spot him. He'll be the handsome young braggart with great hair and full lips, laughing carelessly with a fat, scarred, toothless old hag on his arm. That unfortunate broad is Sheriff Jordan's lawfully wedded wife, and for reasons we don't quite understand, he's eager to get her back. There's $200 in it for you, if you could help reunite poor Sheriff Jordan with his lovely bride and bring the obnoxious, thieving philanderer Isaac Mize to justice. But we shouldn't get our hopes up, because they're probably long gone by now.
This just in, we have a breaking news update. Sheriff Jordan's fair, fat, and 40 wife has been arrested in the company of her paramour. On the 6th of February last, the wife of S.E. Jordan, Sheriff of Randolph County, Alabama, eloped with an ex-federal soldier named Isaac Mize, leaving her disconsolate husband alone at home, from whence he at once proceeded to advertise the guilty party, sending handbills all over the South and offering a $200 reward for their apprehension. The advertisement was so uniquely gotten up that it was copied free of charge in the local columns of many of the leading newspapers throughout the country.
Not to mention the extremely popular Dead Presidents podcast.
In it, he described his wife as a lovely gazelle of some 40 summers, with decayed teeth and a scar on her neck, weighing only 160 pounds. Mize he described as a shyster who had not only stolen his wife but $125 of his money and left him bound for him to a considerable amount. The advertisement posted at every police station in the South and given a place in the newspapers,
and on the smash hit Dead Presidents podcast,
had the desired effect. On Tuesday of this week, Mize and the runaway wife of the indefatigable sheriff were arrested at Stevenson, Alabama, and are now in custody there, awaiting his arrival, when they will be disposed of as he in his mercy shall see fit. Listeners, one of you just got $200 richer, as our far-reaching advertisement came through just in time to save Sheriff Jordan's unraveling marriage. It'll now be up to the sheriff to decide what cruel and unusual punishments should be visited upon Isaac Mize, and how long Mrs. Jordan will have to stay on her knees begging for forgiveness. One thing's for sure, if I'm Sheriff Jordan, Before I take Mrs. Jordan back into the marital bed, I'm having her thoroughly examined by Dr. Hastings Hall.
That's right.
Just to make sure she hasn't picked up any syphilis, gonorrhea, or the like on her misadventurous frolic. And if you're the lucky listener entitled to that $200 reward, hit us up on Twitter at DeadPresPodcast and offer us a cut of the profits, because you wouldn't even have heard about it if not for the Dead Presidents Podcast.
And now, back to the show. And we're back. It's time to dive into the post-presidential life of Andrew Johnson.
Yep. We're back, and Johnson is back in Greenville, Tennessee for the first time in 8 years.
That's right.
He's not in public life anymore.
No, and he's had a pretty rough time, so hopefully things are going to look up now that he's home. Except
Well,
they're not. Because within months, his son Robert commits suicide.
Ugh.
Robert, he'd served in the Union Cavalry in Tennessee, and also as his father's private secretary during his presidency. He suffered from that old devil, that pesky old tuberculosis, as well as that insatiable demon that is alcoholism.
Yep.
And he would actually spend time in an asylum while Johnson was president. This isn't exactly a standalone with the Johnsons.
No.
Johnson's eldest son, Charles, had been an assistant surgeon during the war, and he died in 1863 after being thrown from his horse. Johnson's youngest son, Andrew Jr., also plagued with TB and alcoholism. He's only going to outlive his father briefly, dying in 1879 at the ripe age of 26.
Yep. That TB and alcoholism is a rough combo.
It is.
Johnson, he had a couple daughters as well. His youngest, Mary, she was married and had 3 children before her husband died of tuberculosis during the Civil War. TB, a curse on the Johnson clan.
Indeed.
She remarried in 1869, but later got divorced. Martha Johnson Patterson, who served as White House hostess, was married to a lawyer and had 2 children. She and her descendants would inherit the Johnson homestead in Greenville and successfully lobbied for its preservation as a historical site.
That's right. We didn't really touch on it. Martha Johnson Patterson was the White House hostess during her father's presidency. Kind of pulling a Harriet Lane, in a sense, in lieu of a First Lady, Eliza Johnson, being too ill to perform the duties you had with...
TB dragging her down.
That's right. And we've talked about Jane Pierce.
Yeah.
Being ill, and Abby Kent Means taking on the role. So we kind of have that going on here with Martha Johnson Patterson, who could be credited as the de facto, quote-unquote, First Lady during the presidency of Andrew Johnson.
Johnson, he's going to be a little restless in his post-presidency. He is bored by life outside of politics, and he is pretty much almost immediately going to start angling to get back in the game.
That's right. He's a politician. That's what he's become. He's a self-made man. And he's not ready to give it up yet.
No? I mean, you had, some former presidents, Millard Fillmore, Martin Van Buren, taking more runs at the presidency, and then you had John Quincy Adams taking a seat in the House, the only other president to really accept, a lesser role.
Yeah.
Johnson, he's not too proud about what office he's going to shoot for. He wants to get back in the Senate.
Yeah.
And he's aided in his efforts by the fact of Ku Klux Klan violence suppressing black vote in Tennessee.
Yeah.
Because, we had that 15th Amendment that guaranteed their right to vote. Mm-hmm. But
that didn't mean that
good luck getting to the polls.
Yeah, that's it.
So the Democrats are going to retake the Tennessee legislature in 1869, and Johnson's going to be one of the prime candidates for the U.S. Senate, even though he is hated by Republicans and mistrusted by the ex-Confederate Democrats of Tennessee due to his harsh pro-union stance as wartime governor.
Yeah.
But he's going to come within one vote of being returned to the Senate. Pretty close.
Pretty close. About as close as you could get.
Yep. And he's not done. In 1872, he failed to secure the Democratic nomination for a seat in the House of Representatives and proceeded to run as a third-party independent candidate. Came in third place.
Yeah. But he's not done. It's time to go on a speaking tour. It's time to tour the state because the 1875 Senate election is coming up, and Johnson is going to woo his old base of low and middle class white voters.
He's going back to his roots.
That's right. Johnson goes back to his roots, and with few people of color actually able to vote, Democrats are going to continue to dominate the state legislature. And said legislature is split among many candidates for senator, but Johnson leads the balloting, and his opponents, well, they can't agree on a candidate to oppose him. Thereby, Andrew Johnson is elected to the Senate on the 54th ballot. Johnson would say, quote, "Thank God for the vindication." Well, if you want to call it that. So, in March 1875, Johnson's going back to Washington, rejoining the Senate that had almost removed him from the presidency.
It's kind of an awkward scene.
Hey.
Stepping into the Senate chamber like, "Hey guys, remember me?
Hey, yeah.
I'm back."
I'm back. It's a bit of a comeback. Not gonna get, embraced.
Well,
by any stretch. Some senators are gonna just outright ignore him. Though he's gonna be greeted cordially by certain members that had voted for his removal. He's only gonna speak one time during the short session, denouncing President Grant's use of federal troops to enforce Reconstruction in Louisiana, saying, quote, "How far off is military despotism?" and concluding, "May God bless this people, and God save the Constitution."
Vintage Andy Johnson.
Yeah.
He goes back to Tennessee after the Senate session ends, and he's at his daughter Mary's farm in Elizabethton, Tennessee, when he suffers a stroke. He initially refused medical attention. 2 days later, he suffered another, more debilitating stroke and died the following morning on July 31st, 1875, at the age of 66.
Yeah.
First Lady Eliza McCardle Johnson died of tuberculosis 6 months later.
That's it. Now, harken back to the Andy Johnson quote that opened the episode, and those wishes came true for Johnson. He was buried wrapped in the American flag with a copy of the Constitution beneath his head.
how he wanted to go out.
Yeah. And he got that.
Yep.
Well, that's the end of the life of Andrew Johnson.
As we mentioned, Mary Johnson Patterson and her descendants saw to it that the Johnson homestead became a historical site, and we had the opportunity to visit there on one of our swings through Tennessee.
That's right.
In Greenville on the eastern side of Tennessee.
Yeah, and not only can you see the final home of Andrew Johnson, but you could see two other homes that he lived in. His birth home, pretty much reconstructed and moved there.
Yeah.
Then his tailor shop is there, housed inside another building. You get the full Andy Johnson experience.
Yeah.
We'll say that much.
Yep.
In Greenville, Tennessee.
I think during our time in Greenville we had a full Andy Johnson style experience.
One could say that.
Yeah. Kind of the way Johnson prepared for his inauguration speech, and
and one of us made just as much of an ass out of himself. I'm not gonna say who.
Well, at least we didn't pick up any TB.
That's right. We were able to avoid that.
Yep.
Thanks to our beloved sponsors.
Yep. Well, Greenville, Tennessee is not a dry town, and Andrew Johnson wouldn't have it any other way.
That's right.
But be sure to check it out if you're ever in the area.
That's it. It's pretty cool. I mean, it's one of the few places, we'll talk about Calvin Coolidge, but there's not a lot of places where they have, like, multiple preserved, like, places where they actually lived and spent time.
Yeah, his tailor shop was pretty cool. You really get a sense of the world that he lived in.
That's it, and you get to see some of his outfits. I mean, he made all his own outfits and stuff. I mean, I don't know. Andy Johnson is a person. I mean, he's a very stubborn person.
Yeah.
He's pretty self-conscious. He definitely has a grudge against anybody with money. He's an envious person. He envies people.
Yeah, he really...
In a sense.
Yeah. I think he really carried a chip on his shoulder his whole life.
Yeah.
You know, from his humble birth, and he got to a high position, but he, really maintained kind of a bitterness about it.
Yeah.
Almost like a spiteful attitude, proving himself, and that's, I think, part of what his stubbornness came from, is not ever wanting to admit that he was wrong.
Yeah.
To prove that he, belonged where he was.
Yeah.
And, it's really, he was president during a time when someone with more compromising attitude probably would have done more. 'Cause he probably, he had an opportunity to work with moderate Republicans in Congress, but he was, pretty set on his own ways.
That's it.
And didn't budge. And once Congress saw that he wasn't going to play ball, they played their own version of ball right back at him.
Yeah. Yeah, and of course, I mean, another, thing that detracts from is, something that a lot of presidents have in common is he was a racist.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think, his racism really had a chance to kind of run wild more than the, presidents who may have owned slaves but were president during a time when the whole issue was kind of brushed aside.
Yeah.
That was really the forefront issue. Like, Lincoln did what he could, but this was a real opportunity to make progress.
Yeah.
And Johnson had no interest whatsoever in that at all. Kind of tried to turn the clock back as much as he could. Didn't really care about the human cost.
That's it. How does the complete book of U.S. presidents sum up Andrew Johnson as a person? Always nice to try and bring these cats to life if possible. They describe Johnson as stocky though well proportioned, 5'10", a swarthy complexion. Health generally sound, but suffers kidney stones as president. He tailors his own clothes. I mean, that kind of goes without saying. Polk was his own barber. Johnson was his own tailor. Those two could have teamed up.
Yeah.
And had a real line of men's fashion.
Oh, yeah.
That could have changed the game. Personality-wise, Johnson is described as, quote, simple and direct in manner. He spoke bluntly, and to some appeared cold. He was generally reserved and sober, but went out of his way to remain on friendly terms with old acquaintances, and often loaned money to people down on their luck. I found him kind and helpful, recalled one Tennessee neighbor, especially to poor young men, and he was entirely without condescension. Because of his own common roots, he throughout his life identified with the underdog. He shunned Washington society, preferring the company of old friends. Yet he was ever polite, and carried himself with great dignity. Possessed of a strong, clear voice, he was a gifted orator.
Well, we've seen the results of that personality
That's right.
on the biggest stage.
Indeed. Can you learn more about Andrew Johnson than we've already taught you in these past 3 hours? Well, maybe.
Yeah, there are some good books you could check out. I mentioned Impeached by David O. Stewart. Pretty good account of the impeachment drama.
That's right. The classic go-to scholarly biography on Andrew Johnson by Hans L. Trefus, or Trefaus, or perhaps Trefois. Not sure. But that's kind of a go-to.
Yeah, I also read the more concise American Presidents series biography of Johnson, written by Annette Gordon Reed, the Pulitzer Prize-winning author of The Hemmingses of Monticello that we mentioned in the Jefferson episode.
That's right.
That book, not a lot of kind of facts and dates kind of detail, but really goes into his racial attitudes a lot.
Yeah. Yeah, and for a broad look on the times, definitely check out Eric Foner's book on Reconstruction. Fantastic. There's also, I think it's a PBS documentary, Reconstruction, America's Second Civil War. Pretty well done. You get a little bit of Andy Johnson in there, but it's more about just Reconstruction. All of it. Kind of sad.
Well, let's leave the last word on Andy Johnson to his contemporaries.
Indeed.
We'll let them sum him up. We've got Jefferson Davis, who said in 1865 of Johnson, "One of the people by birth, he remained so by conviction, continually referring to his origin. He was indifferent to money and careless of praise or censure."
Senator Charles Sumner, in 1868, during the impeachment trial, said, quote, "This is one of the last great battles with slavery. Driven from the legislative chambers, driven from the field of war, This monstrous power has found a refuge in the executive mansion where, in utter disregard of the Constitution and laws, it seeks to exercise its ancient, far-reaching sway. All of this is very plain. Nobody can question it. Andrew Johnson is the impersonation of the tyrannical slave power. In him, it lives again.
Wow.
Pretty harsh words from Charles Sumner.
Oh, yeah. He was not a fan. And then we got Abraham Lincoln. He said in 1864, "No man has a right to judge Andrew Johnson in any respect who has not suffered as much and done as much as he has for the nation's sake."
Some benevolent words from Abraham Lincoln.
Yep.
And last but certainly not least, the words of Frederick Douglass upon his first meeting with Andrew Johnson. Quote, "On this inauguration day, while waiting for the opening of the ceremonies, I made a discovery in regard to the Vice President Andrew Johnson. There are moments in the lives of most men when the doors of their souls are open, and unconsciously to themselves, their true characters may be read by the observant eye. It was at such an instant I caught a glimpse of the real nature of this man, which by all subsequent developments proved true. I was standing in the crowd by the side of Mrs. Thomas J. Dorsey when Mr. Lincoln touched Mr. Johnson and pointed me out to him. The first expression which came to his face, and which I think was the true index of his heart, was one of bitter contempt and aversion. Seeing that I observed him, he tried to assume a more friendly appearance, but it was too late. It was useless to close the door when all within had been seen. His first glance was the frown of the man. The second was the bland and sickly smile of the demagogue. I turned to Mrs. Dorsey and said, 'Whatever Andrew Johnson may be, he certainly is no friend to our race.' And with that, we close the book on Andrew Johnson, 17th President of these United States, and one who you all now know just as well as any other president that we've covered thus far on the Dead Presidents podcast.
Yep. We will leave the final sounds on Andrew Johnson, as always, to our favorite band and yours, the Constitutionalists.
That's right. Here is Andrew Johnson.
Thanks for listening.
Way down south in the land of traitors, rattlesnakes and alligators, right away, come away, right away, come away. Where cotton's king and men are chattel, Union boys will win the battle, right away, come away, right away, come away.
I have fought traitors and treason in the South. I opposed the Davises and Toombses, the Slidells, and a long list of others whose names I need not repeat. And now when I turn around at the other end of the line, I find men I care not by what name you call them, who still stand opposed to the restoration of the Union of these states. And I am free to say to you that I am still for the restoration of this Union. I am still in favor of this great government of ours going on and following out its destiny.
Give them our names!
Gentlemen calls for their names. Well, I suppose I should give them.
We already know.
I look upon them, I repeat it, as president or citizen, as being as much opposed to the fundamental principles of this government, and believe they are as much laboring to pervert and destroy them as were the men who fought against us.
All the names!
I I say Thaddeus Stevens of Pennsylvania. I say Charles Sumner. I say Wendell Phillips, and others of the same stripe are among them.
Give it to Forney!
Some gentleman in the crowd says, give it to Forney. I only just have to say that I do not waste my ammunition on dead ducks. I stand for my country. I stand for the Constitution, where I place my feet for my entrance into public life. They may traduce me, they may slander me, they may vituperate, but let me say to you that it has no effect upon me. And let me say in addition that I do not intend to be bullied by my enemies.
We're behind you, Andy. Can you?
I know, my countrymen, that it has been insinuated, and not only insinuated but said directly. The intimation has been given in high places that if such a usurpation of power had been exercised 200 years ago in a particular reign, it would have cost a certain individual his head. What usurpation has Andrew Johnson been guilty of? Usurpation I have been guilty of has always been standing between the people and the encroachments of power.